Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to welcome you to the NERI Atlanta Fall Conference, and we'd like to bring to the stage Jane Elliott, Vice President of Investor Relations of Global Payments.
Thanks. Thank you. Good morning. As President of the NERI Atlanta chapter, I welcome all of you for coming out today and being here at our first Fall Conference. For those of you in the audience that are not familiar with NERI, NERI is National Investor Relations Institute. Last year, our board came up with a mission statement, Participate, Learn, Lead. This statement has served as our guideline in developing our programs and events for our members. Most of you have seen the 3 awards that we had proudly displayed on our registration table, and I'm very pleased to report that Atlanta received Best Overall Chapter, Best Member Services, and Best Programs in the Small Chapter category this past June at the annual NERI conference. I want to thank you. Thank you. I'm going to thank the board members from last year, and before you applaud, I'd like to hold it all to the end because this is quite an accomplishment. The board members last year spent a lot of time and effort in trying to bring you all the best programs that we could come up with. And today there were several members that were not able to attend. I'm going to read their names off first. Diane Dayhoff and Isabel Jancy from the Home Depot. Allison Parker, Fresh Communication. Jeff Dodge, Equifax. And Robert Borchert from Med Assets. And then for the few that are here today, Beverly Verico from BNY Mellon. Beverly's in the back. Carrie Phelps, Spectrum Brands. Carrie, you want to stand? Thank you. And then finally, Quinn Hudson, Hudson Group. Quinn, where are you? And please give them a round of applause for this achievement. I'd also like to recognize Allison Parker, and unfortunately, she's in Hawaii today. That's tough. Allison received the Individual Leadership Award from NERI National for the Atlanta chapter for all of her efforts on our website redesign last year. So please congratulate her even though she's not here. Next, I'd like to welcome 3 new board members for this year, because now we have a very high bar that we have to get over this year, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. Aaron Udi from Invesco. Aaron, are you in the room? Aaron? Martin Jarosik from Georgia Golf Corporation. Martin. And also Neil Wells from Business Wire, but Neil got called out on business unexpectedly. So as you can see from the list of our board members in the programs that you all have in the back, we have another great group of folks from a wide, diverse variety of companies. So we expect to keep with the same mission, participate, learn, and lead. And in doing so, this is how we came up with today's conference. Before we move on, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to members from other professional groups. This is a first time for NERI Atlanta in inviting numerous groups, and those groups were CFO Roundtable, CFA, the Society of Corporate Secretaries, Financial Executives International, and the Financial Executives Group. Thank you all for participating and coming out to see us. So based on these interesting and challenging times, we all decided many of us would be interested in the topics we're showcasing here today. All of us in this room interact with multiple internal and external parties each and every day and are required to be leaders in our own right. We will hear from a prominent CEO on leadership in challenging times. We also have 2 panels, governance and disclosure, and valuation trends that reflect experienced and knowledgeable participants that are each experts in their fields. The program that you have in the bags that you received this morning has the morning's agenda on it, the speakers' bios, the calendar for NERI's programs for the rest of the year, and also a list of our sponsors. Without this list of sponsors, today would not have been possible. So before I have to do the, now a message from our sponsors, but this is going to be me saying all this. First, I'd like to thank Business Wire. Business Wire, everybody I think knows what they do. They provide, they're a bunch of communication professionals that provide a wide distribution range of options for all of us to get our news out. And if anybody is here from Business Wire, I'd like you to stand so we can see you. Thank you very much. BNY Mellon Share Owner Services. I think we know what they all do, but just in case, they are one of the largest providers of equity administration services in the U.S., and Beverly here represents them. Beverly, can you wave? Thank you. Let's see, next, I want to thank UPS for this wonderful facility that we're in today. We really appreciate the use of their facility. And obviously, we all know that UPS is one of the world's largest package delivery companies. iPrio is a global leader in the provision of market-leading intelligence. Is Michael Lynch here? Michael, thanks. Crit Graham Associates designed the program. Crit Graham offers many design services for all your marketing and communication needs. Carrie Graham, is she in the room? Carrie, thank you. Intersect Group is a technology, accounting, and financial staffing firm and consulting firm, and they donated towards the cost of the printing of our programs, and I think Ray is here from Intersect. Admento Promotions Group donated the bags. There's nobody here representing them today. And then finally, JCS Media provided the registration capability on our website and is also here today providing for our AV and webcasting needs. Joseph Stanley, thank you. So I encourage you all to actually look at these people and consider utilizing their services if the need arises within your own organization. So before we move on, please, a round of applause for our sponsors. Okay, finally, I need to cover a few housekeeping items. This conference qualifies as 4 CPEs. So after the Valuation Trends panel, I encourage all of those that need those CPE credits to move towards the registration table, and you can get your certificate. And we also are providing CLE credits. So for those of you that need that, you need to also go to the registration table, sign up, and then you'll receive an email later about how to actually receive the credit. Also, the Society will be holding a lunch and learn here at UPS on September 29th, and I encourage you to contact Beverly Verico for details. The NERI program in October is on the 16th in the morning at Maggiano's from 7:30 to 9, and that will be on XBRL. So I encourage you to go to neriatlanta.org to sign up for that. I'm also required to tell you about the exits in this building in case of an emergency. So please use the doors outside and to the right as you came in to exit the building. We have 2 breaks during the program, so I encourage you to go back over to the room behind the registration table to get refreshments. As you figured out, we're not allowed to have food and drink in the auditorium. Also, the program is being webcast and recorded, so any questions asked must be spoken into a microphone. We will have 2 people managing the mics on either side, so if you just wait and somebody will get to you. And then finally, we have a great buffet lunch downstairs in the cafeteria, and we encourage you to go ahead and go down there, network, and share ideas with your peers. Now, without further ado, I'd like to open up today's program with our keynote speaker. He has over 30 years of business experience leading companies and driving the charge as all of his companies have significantly grown and evolved over the years. He is the chairman and CEO of Global Payments, Paul Garcia.
Thank you. Thanks, Janie. Good job, Philip. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. So Jane said, would you be willing to participate in our golf outing? And I said, of course. It's not a golf outing, Jane. She told me last night, it's not actually a golf outing. And then she points out the exits. So that's a strong introduction, don't you think? So this guy is so charismatic. Let me tell you where the exits are, because you may be in such a stupor that if something happens, you have to kind of follow each other out. It was nice to hear Jane say something that didn't begin with a safe harbor, though. That was lovely. But truly, and this wasn't part of the scripted comments, but truly, we're very fortunate to have Jane. And based on all the awards that your chapter has earned, I can see you're very lucky to have Jane as well. But the CEO and I think pretty much the CFO of any company pretty well measures IR on a couple metrics. Number one, truly, is how many calls do you get? I mean, if I don't get many calls from investors, it could be because I don't have a lot of answers. That's what Jane would recommend would be the answer. But no, truly, Jane does such a good job and has such a wonderful rapport with our investors. And it's, some huge funds to smaller investors, to 30 sell-side firms do research, 29 sell-side firms. Can you imagine? We're not that interesting, I promise you. 29 sell-side firms publish research on global payments. And Jane has to balance them all. And of course, somebody comes in, I can't tell you the latest, but they're all excited. Great news, we're going to pick up coverage on your company. And we kind of groan. And of course, what do? They want to take me on a road show. They want us to go to all their conferences. They want us to speak. And, if we did that for 30 guys twice a year, I would be up here serving as the bad example. So Jane does a fabulous job of balancing all that. We have, how many buys do we have as opposed to holds? No sells. Yeah, 70% buys. So, and Jane keeps all that going. So my thank you. I want to give you a little applause now. Well, I have some comments to share with you on that subject, and it's kind of a grandiose subject. So I really struggled with that because you don't want to stand up here sounding like you have any great insight into leadership in troubled times. So what I thought I'd do is just share just about 2 minutes of comments on my company, just to put things into context, and then share some comments about a favorite topic of mine, and that's capitalism and free enterprise, because I feel a little bit like it's under attack. And I'll share with you some thoughts on that in just a second. So as many of you may not be familiar with us, so we are GPN. We are a New York Stock Exchange listed company. We spun from National Data Corporation. My old colleague, Pat Wilson, is sitting right there. She's general counsel for the company we spun from. She made sure that we got as much debt from them as we possibly could. Thank you. I want to thank you for that. And, here's the good news. I have the microphone. You're in big trouble, I got to tell you right now. So it went actually very well for Global Payments, I'm pleased to say. So we spun in February 2001. We got to ring the bell. How many of you guys had a chance to do that? Is that the coolest? So I know it sounds hokey, but it's like throwing out the first pitch in baseball. Jane's done it a couple times. It's very cool. We process credit and debit and check transactions for over 1 million merchants. Those are the people that accept Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, debit cards, and checks. We are in North America. Actually, in the U.S. is probably our smallest presence. We're in the United Kingdom. We have a leadership role there. We're number 2 or 3. We are one of the largest, if not the largest, in Central Europe. We have about 500 people that work for us in Prague in the Czech Republic. Fortunately, Delta has nonstop flights from here to Prague and to places like Kiev, where we also do business. As I said, it's really great to get on a plane in Hartsfield, get off in Kiev. The problem is you're in Kiev, but at least it's nonstop. We're in Russia, non-stops there to Moscow. We just did a big acquisition in Russia, and we're the largest merchant acquirer in Russia, a country that has 150 million people. And at the end of the day, they really want to be like us. They want to have access to consumer credit. They want to own cars. They want to own homes. They want their children to be educated. They want to take vacations. And consumer credit are going to be a big driver of that, and we're right in the middle of that country. And as of yesterday, when we took the missiles down, they like us more. Although my colleagues in the Czech Republic sent me a note and said, once again, the Americans are abandoning us. So you can't win on that. We have, importantly, 11 countries and markets in Asia. And just yesterday, we've crossed some pretty big hurdles to allow us to acquire credit card transactions directly with a local debit scheme in China called CUP. They have 1 billion debit cards in China, 1 billion debit cards. 10 years ago, they didn't have one debit card. That's the beauty of the Chinese system. I mean, they don't quite get the human rights thing, but they certainly are efficient, I will tell you that. So someday, this is a true story. So one day a central party guy came in and said, you know, our citizens are getting paid renminbi, the local currency, at the end of the week by their employers. Wouldn't it be more efficient if we put that into a bank account? Somebody said, well, nobody has bank accounts. He said, we can fix that. So they came to work next week, and you went to your boss and said, where's my money? And they said, we put it in your bank account. So I don't have a bank account. Well, you do now. Congratulations. So how do I get my money? You use this debit card. So overnight, 1 billion debit cards. It's really true. And they gave them all the same PIN number, 8888, which is lucky. And they said, please change these. So to this day, if you're in China and you pick up a debit card, put in 8888, 10 years later, it works. No one changed their PIN number. So 1 billion cards with the same PIN number. But it's truly a massive market. And the Chinese have this, this expanding middle class, and they're traveling to places that we do business, and they're very interested in having a relationship with us and we with them. So it's a huge opportunity for us. We're very excited about that. So if you make a purchase from any of our million-plus merchants in any of these geographies I talked about, Central Europe, Russia, Canada, we're a leader in Canada, in the United States, those transactions in Asia go through us. We authorize the transaction. We send the approval or the decline, in some cases, to the merchant. Then we pay the merchant. So on a $100 transaction, we would pay them $98 typically. So we keep 2%, 150 basis points, 1.5% goes to the bank. That's called interchange. A little bit goes to the card associations. That's called an assessment. And the remaining, in that scenario, about 40 cents is what we do. And we have about 1.8 billion of those 40-cent fees. And that's how our company's made up. The beauty of this, I had dinner last night with the new CEO of NCR, which they just came to town, and we had a chamber function welcoming him. It was pretty cool. And we were talking about our businesses, and I said, you know, we don't have things like daily sales outstanding. We don't even have that. We don't have receivables. How about that? Our company does not have receivables because we debit our merchants every second, and we don't pay them until we get our fee. That's a very nice part of our business. We also have a consumer money transfer business that has 700 locations throughout the United States and Spain, sending money primarily to Latin America for consumers. We are headquartered literally right down the street on Corporate Drive off of Abernathy. We have 6,000 employees approximately, living in 22 countries. We actually have more employees outside the U.S. than we have inside. Our market capitalization, as Pat will remember, at the time of our spin was about $400 million, and quite frankly, we were lucky to have that. The company was declining on the top line, or declining on the bottom line, and we really had some struggles. Our revenues were about $350 million when we spun 8 years ago. We operated in basically the United States, so coming up with the name Global Payments took a little hubris, quite frankly, because we weren't global. But we had a little bit in Canada, and I said, hell, they have the World Series, right? I mean, it works for them. So there is precedent. You can see why Jane reads the Safe Harbor so often when I speak. Is that clear to everyone now? And that's why when I compliment her, and you can tell she has a lot of hard work to do. She said, you said what to whom? I hear that a lot. She actually has a sign she just holds up when we have meetings. So today, our revenues have increased over 500%, I'm pleased to say, and 50% being generated from outside the U.S. So we kind of grew into our name. I'm very pleased with that. Our market cap as of yesterday, everyone had a little bump, is $3.67 billion and a couple cents. Not that we look at it. I want you to know that. Okay, enough about global payments. So let's talk about the subject at hand. I think these are interesting times for all of us in this room. Our businesses are being challenged, I believe, like never before. Many consumers are experiencing severe economic setbacks, and with almost 10% of our countrymen out of work, and according to Dennis Lockhart, our Atlanta Fed chair, who's a really good guy and a very bright guy, we're very lucky to have him. Anybody been to the Fed? Visit that? Is that the coolest building? They give you the mints, like $100 bills in little rolls. We pay for that, is the only down part. According to Dennis Lockhart, there's another 7% of people who have either just stopped looking altogether because they're just like given up, or they're working part-time. I mean, they'd like full-time work, they just can't find it. So if you add those together, it's like 17% of our countrymen are actually either out of work or underemployed. And that's a feeling of helplessness that I just can't imagine, and I wouldn't want to ever have my children experience that. But that's the reality in the context of what we're dealing with. And we also face questions from increasingly skeptical public about our ability, businesses' ability, to lead us out of this economic morass we find ourselves in. On top of that, our current administration isn't exactly embracing or endorsing business. I thought that, I was excited when President Obama was elected. I truly was. We have 6 children, and my kids were like very into it. And I said it says a lot about our country, and I was really very proud of that moment. But I was disappointed when, on the anniversary of the Lehman collapse, the really only true business presentation our president has made, he goes to Federal Hall and basically dresses down business guys. And if you could see the pictures of that, there's the president standing there, and all the audience is finding something very interesting on the floor to stare at. Like we're looking at their BlackBerries. They basically just got beat up in front of everybody. And I'm not sure that's what we need right now. Certainly there's enough blame to go around, but I think we got to start talking about how business is going to get us out of this. So consequently, we find ourselves in the defensive more and more with our shareholders, with regulators. We have someone from Risk Metrics here. Is he actually here? You're there over there? Thank God they got you in the corner. That's all I got to say. Just kidding. I got some very positive things to say about Risk Metrics. Actually, I'm kidding about that. No, I do, really do. Although I'm going to stay for your panel and harass you if you ask me difficult questions, so just keep that in mind. So we have, we're on the defense with our shareholders, our regulators, and correctly so, quite frankly, in both of those scenarios, I believe, and sometimes even our own boards, and that's a tough environment. So the business climate, I've been doing this for 30 years, I've been in payments for 30 years, and the business climate has changed enormously. I mean, I've never seen anything like this in 30 years. So what can we do? What can we do? What can CEOs do, CFOs, IR professionals, attorneys, all the leadership, especially the very visible public leadership of companies? What can we do? What should we do? So I don't purport to have any deep insight. And although our company has experienced some success, we certainly aren't in a position to provide any single-handed leadership. We're not a household name. We don't even advertise. We're a business to business. But there's several things that we all can do that I think can make a real difference. Do you guys remember the story of the little girl and the starfish? Anybody remember that story? If you have kids, you got to know this story. Okay, I see a couple of heads nodding. So this little girl's on the beach, and the tide is rapidly withdrawing, and thousands and thousands of starfish. Anybody want to finish this with me? You can. Thousands of starfish are exposed. So this little girl goes to pick up a starfish, and this adult says, dear, what are you doing? You really can't make a difference here. I mean, there's thousands of starfish for miles. That's just all we can see. So you're not going to make a difference. So she picks up the starfish, undeterred, goes out in deep water, drops the starfish, and she turns to the adult politely and says, I made a difference for that one. So it's kind of in that context that I want to make some comments. So here's what we all can do. Firstly, I think common sense. Let's run our businesses successfully and skillfully. Let's not be mired in what's going on. Let's not be timid. Let's, if we have opportunities, let's take advantage of them. As we succeed, we will undoubtedly expend capital. We will invest in R&D. We'll create new jobs. We'll expand into new geographies. We'll lease or build new facilities. We'll get things going again. By doing so, we will make, collectively, all of us, a real difference for our employees, for people we hire, for our customers, for our vendors, for our shareholders, for our communities. All of our companies and many of our employees also support a number of not-for-profit enterprises. You know, Atlanta is so blessed with that. I mean, right in this facility, UPS is amazing. Last night I had dinner with Delta Airlines, with Coca-Cola, with Home Depot. I mean, this community is unbelievably blessed. These causes need us now more than ever. As point of fact, Atlanta has more individuals participating at the leadership level of the United Way, called the de Tocqueville Society, named in honor of Alexis de Tocqueville, than any city. And I don't mean on a per capita. Did you guys know that? We literally have more people participating, total numbers, than New York or Chicago or San Francisco or LA. That's truly amazing. This is a very philanthropic city. Speaking of de Tocqueville, let me share this with you. In his famous work, of course, Democracy in America, he discusses the truly American phenomena of philanthropy. In the words of Monsieur de Tocqueville, quote, "An enlightened regard for themselves prompts them to assist each other and inclines them to willingly sacrifice a portion of their time and treasure to the welfare of the state and the community." It truly is a unique American phenomena. The fact that our standard of living remains the envy of the world and that our numerous not-for-profit enterprises are thriving even in these times, I mean, they're under pressure, but they're still doing very well, is testimony that Monsieur de Tocqueville got it just right 170 years ago. Secondly, when it is necessary to terminate staff, and unfortunately we've all been there, let's do it in a way that allows for as much dignity as possible and as soft of a landing as possible. Be mindful that it's usually more our fault than it is the person we're terminating, particularly when we close down entire operations. I heard an expression recently that I wish I was clever enough to have made up. It's called red carpet in and red carpet out. And I think that really captures what we try to do at Global Payments. Are we perfect? Absolutely not. But that truly is the mindset we start with. We also have incorporated generosity into we redid our missions and our values, kind of tweaked them. But the thing we changed, we put the concept of generosity into our values. Talking about being generous with our people, being generous with our customers, giving more than is expected. And that includes, unfortunately, in scenarios where you have to terminate someone. So you be as generous as you can. It's a small amount of money, but it gives you a lot of goodwill, and it has everyone else feel very good about it. And really importantly, I think management feels better about it too. Lastly, we need to do our best to influence potential regulators and regulations that look harmful while embracing changes that make sense. And changes that make sense that provide more transparency, or just, kind of things that are no-brainers. For example, I mean, shouldn't the CEO be required to sign the financial statements? I mean, there are actually some people that came out against that. And how ridiculous is that? And we all know if it gets screwed up, it's the CFO's fault anyway. I learned that first day on the job. I believe, and I hope not naively, that the more business does to self-regulate, the less the regulators will be inclined to mandate new requirements. We also have a responsibility to educate anyone who will listen to what my good friend, Dr. Paul Voss, has anyone heard of Paul Voss? He's a professor at Georgia State, and he teaches business ethics. He's a renowned speaker. He writes articles, and we've hired him for our company, and he has the most energetic, really exciting presentations about ethics. I mean, he talks everything from Mussolini to Socrates, and it's really riveting stuff. Truly, it's exciting. People are very happy to get the presentation, but the message is, let's always do the right thing. I mean, ethics should be the core of everything we do. And, for 99.9% of the people and companies, it is. Now, he did an article in the AJC recently, an op-ed piece, and he talks about the ethics of profits. So companies and people, here's the theme basically, companies and people simply just don't make money. Just don't fall out of bed and make money. Sustainable profits and income, it must be earned, and it's going to be the result of significant investments of time, of talent, hard work, and capital. Even then, profits are only made in a very competitive environment, competing against people who are similarly motivated to win and beat you. So, making money is quite simply, profits quite simply are a validation that you're succeeding. And higher profits, even things like record profits, signal even greater success, sustainable record profits. So let's never be ashamed of our success, ever, even as we inevitably make some mistakes, and we're all going to make some mistakes. So speaking of success, let me share this with you recently. This came to my attention. There was this CEO retiring after a long, illustrious career, and they interviewed him in a local newspaper. And the reporter said, "Could you please share your secret of success?" And the executive said, "2 words, young man." I said, "What are those, sir?" "Right decisions." The reporter said, "And how do you make right decisions?" He said, "1 word." So what is that, sir? He said, "Experience." I said, "That's great. How do you get experience?" He said, 2 words, wrong decisions. So each of you, as you face your business, as the face of your business to the investment community, you're in a unique position to help get the message out that capitalism, with all of its flaws, all of its mistakes, works. The economy will return to growth, I guarantee that, absolutely, positively. The human spirit is indomitable. We will return to growth. We'll return to growth that may not have been some unsupportable numbers, but will return to growth. It's just a matter of timing. We need to remind all of our constituents that free markets sometimes go down as well as up, and capitalism, although far from perfect, is better than any alternative ever created. Thank you. So Jane indicated, thank you very much. And I was delighted to see that no one made for the exit. And now you know where they are, too. So you had a choice. I'm delighted to entertain some questions, if that is appropriate, and we have a little time to do so.
Hi, Paul. Thank you very much. By the way, the business model sounds great, no receivables. I'm curious if the strategy of your business changed at all as a result of the recession, and if, I'll knock on wood, when it does recover, if it will change again. I'm curious both from a business perspective as well as a communications perspective.
It's a great question. So everyone heard the question. I'm assuming I don't need to repeat it. We are in a little bit of a bubble because we are fortunate enough to have a lot of our business come from outside the United States. So markets like China and markets like India and markets like Russia, we are getting double-digit growth in this environment. Now, before, it might have been 30%, and now it's 15%, but it's still 15%, so we're very, very fortunate. So we have not been crushed to the degree that a lot of people in business have been. But we do have one business that has certainly kept us humble, and that's our money transfer business. And that business has been crushed. Well, that's a very small part of us. It's only about maybe 4% of our income. But it's the business with 700 locations that sends money primarily to South America from Spain and from the United States. They're basically, Spain has massive unemployment. I mean, that was on a bubble. It collapsed. The construction has stopped. Huge buildings have stopped being made. And our customers are typically in construction trades. They're in manual labor, agriculture. And there's a lot of, from the United States in particular, there's a lot of people from Mexico and Central America and some South America that are sending this money. Almost 50% of it goes to Mexico from the U.S. And there are less Mexicans here. There's less jobs employing them. There are some issues with border patrol, et cetera. So that business has dropped off dramatically. And there's very little I can do to create customers. So we've cut costs as much as we can. We have come up with promotions. We've done lots of things. But at the end of the day, if that person is not standing in our lobby with $300 to send to his mom in Guadalajara, there's nothing I can do about that. So in that scenario, we tell people a couple things. Our kind of corporate motto is, remember, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. Remember, it goes up and down. We had time when that business was margin accretive. It was growing terrifically and was growth accretive. Now it's dragging us down. They didn't do anything wrong. We're doing everything we can. We all kind of get around it, and the communication is, look, we're patient. We'll do what we can. We're not panicked. We tell everybody the good and the bad, and we're along for the same ride everyone else is.
Wow,
talk a little bit more about the regulatory pressures facing your business and how you might be communicating with investors during an uncertain environment?
Yeah, I don't think we have any unique regulatory, not that I'm aware of, Jane, do we? Good. We don't have any unique regulatory pressures. But, we all are in an environment where, things like say on pay, just kind of shareholder activism, risk metrics recommending votes that you have to be, you have to understand just what the recommendation is going to be and what you can do about it. And, that world is changing. Now, I will tell you, this might be a little controversial. Some of that is not necessarily bad. I mean, not all Sarbanes was bad. I would tell you most of Sarbanes was okay. And particularly if you were young as we are. I mean, we were just spinning. That was kind of happening. And we were kind of there anyway. So some of these things are actually good. Say on pay, however, is one I'm a little concerned about. I think that at the end of the day, the shareholder has an ability to say on pay. They won't buy your stock. If they think that you're overpaid and you're not producing the results, I think to disclose how you're paid is a very good thing. And all of our companies do that. Our proxy is 30 pages describing how we're paid on every metrics. And I think we're all in that same boat. That's a good thing. People should know. They should know exactly how much you get paid. And is there risk in that? Can you, do you make the same amount in good years and bad years? If you do, that's probably not a good compensation plan. But to have people who may not be in a position to fully understand that, our comp committee meets for, I bet you, 60 hours collectively going over all this and hire outside consultants and really spend a huge amount of time. We have a 4-star general that chairs our comp committee. This is a guy that, made a lot less than I make and had people shooting at him, which I have to explain to him sometimes. Sir, we were in different roles. He said, well, I was actually injured. How about you? Well, you're hurting my feelings. Does that count? So, some of it's good. I would tell you, I don't have any secret sauce. I think you need to be informed. You need to stay close to your major shareholders. We do. We spend a lot of time meeting with all of our big shareholders, and we do somehow, some way, get as close to those 28, 29 sell-side firms as we can. And we try to take as much input as we can, and we try to understand what's going on in Washington as well as we can. I just hope we don't get anything really silly that comes down the pike.
Paul, I'm from a very small company, and when we were talking about 29 analysts that cover you, when we have none, it just amazes me.
I'll send you a couple. But I get to pick.
I was wondering, do you get good advice from them during the recession, and what bad advice have you gotten from your analysts during the recession?
Not so much from the analyst. Our analysts, there are occasional exceptions, but most of them are asking questions and not necessarily offering any ideas, truly. However, our major shareholders, we have one guy that owns, what does T. Rowe own? Like 12%, 13%. So T. Rowe, I have enormous respect for them. Their PM, we're very close to them, and they are very bright, and they don't hesitate to share lots of things with me. Some of them, quite frankly, wrong-headed. They said, I just want you to know, we really don't want you to go into, because we announced we were going to do Russia. We weren't really sure we were going to close it. And they called me up and said, our preference would be you don't go into Russia. And I said, well, noted. But I have to tell you, we think that I was more polite than that as my largest shareholder. I said, oh, that's very interesting. Why is that? Wow, I did not know that. I understand they don't even speak English there. So, no, truly, these guys are very insightful, and they had some bad experiences in Russia. And we're all kind of captive of our own experiences. So I told them, look, here's the risk. Here's the size of the risk. The downside is I write the whole thing off. That's not going to kill me. I don't think that's going to happen. The upside is that this thing really becomes a nice double-digit organic grower. We're in the great position, and we got a super management team. We do. We've got a great Russian management team. That's the upside. What do you think? They said it's worth it to me. So, that worked out pretty well.
Thank you.
Paul, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Given your footprint, which has expanded a lot internationally, from today looking forward, are you looking more for organic growth from the existing footprint, or do you think there's a lot of M&A left for your business? And if so, where would you be looking for that?
You're not one of our 29 sell-side firms, are you? I need to know that right now because I've heard that question from them. I think that's an excellent question. So the issue sometimes with doing acquisitions, and we've grown in large measure by doing acquisitions. I think we've done them well. They've all had great returns on them. We stumbled with Dolex, quite frankly. That was our one little left turn. It's still payments, but it isn't exactly merchant acquiring. But all of our acquisitions I'm very pleased with. But the problem is if that's what you do, and you don't go about the hard work of integrating them and then growing them. I'm very pleased to say our acquisitions have been integrated or in the process of being integrated. Literally right now today we have a platform called G2, Global 2, and it's right down the street. So as we're speaking, we are authorizing transactions from Macau and Hong Kong. Literally people are buying things. It's 9 o'clock Friday night in Hong Kong. So somebody is at a restaurant that does business with us. That transaction is going to Global Payments right here and back to Hong Kong for authorization. So we are integrating these platforms, leveraging an infrastructure, and the business itself is growing double digit. That was all acquisitions. We had no exposure to that market. We think there's more of those opportunities. We only get a couple a year done because they're tough to do. But we think there's more of those opportunities. But if I don't buy another business. I think we can grow this business at a double-digit organic rate for the next 5 years. That's our plan.
I wanted to see what your thoughts are on outsourcing in general, and then maybe for Jane's benefit, what are your thoughts on outsourcing IR? So.
Well, there are some people here today that actually do that. I think it's a terrific concept on the outsourcing IR. I think that particularly works for us. We're considering it. No, I'm kidding. I think I see IR a little bit like human resources. It's key. It's kind of lifeblood, right? You have we only have a couple assets. We have our people, we have our customers, and so human resources is incredibly important to us. The people that touch the customers are incredibly important to us. The people that talk to our investors, that allow us to be a public company and exist and prosper, is very important to us too. But if I were not large enough to justify all that, and I had a choice between kind of a half an effort or paying an outsider to do a really good professional job, I wouldn't hesitate. So I think it makes sense, and I think the same thing for outsourcing. I think every person is wired to want to do everything themselves, but sometimes it's not the best thing. So if someone can really do something for you, listen, I wouldn't exist if financial institutions, banks don't need to sell their businesses to me or partner with me. They do that. HSBC has been in Asia for 160 years. So when we visited them and proposed we do a joint venture, they said, "How long have you been in Asia?" I said, "Can I count this trip? Because that's important." Said like 8 minutes. So they said, "Well, what are you going to do for us? We've been here 160 years." I said, "Look, you're a lot smarter. You know a lot more. You certainly know the market. But we specialize. This is what we do. This is all we do. So give us a shot at this. We will make you better." And I think outsourcing, that's the kind of question you have to ask yourself.
Kind of a related question. In these tough times, a lot of folks are a little more cautious about hiring employees, and quite frankly, just the approach to recruiting has changed. Have you changed your techniques for recruiting, and have you changed your approach for developing folks within your organization?
That's a great question. We have, in fact, changed our approach to recruiting, and I don't think it's necessarily because of the economy, but you can be a little pickier. There's wonderful talent out there. Now, the good news is we're hiring. And the highlight of my week is every week I meet the new employee overview class, at least for our Atlanta facility, which is one of our smaller facilities, but we still have 500 people here. So, we hire people every single week. I meet 5 to 10 people every single week. So we're adding staff at a pretty significant level. Expanding, we have the entire building except one floor. So there are 9 stories over here. And We have changed our approach, though. We did, in fact, outsource that. We're now bringing that more in-house, but working with people that can bring us good opportunities. So it's more of a collaborative effort as opposed to just kind of giving it to somebody. We are doing more internal, but we are working with lots of other resources to kind of leverage our footprint. We're also doing some things we've never done before in terms of psychological testing. And I don't mean, psychological is probably more aptitude testing to see if somebody is best suited. And by the way, anything we subject our employees to, management does first. That goes from drug testing to anything. I mean, you have to say, yeah, I did that. So, and these things are pretty spot on. It's pretty amazing what you find out. Because the worst thing you can do is hire someone in the wrong capacity. They don't have the skill set or the aptitude or that's not really, I would be a terrible accountant, for example. All right, I am a terrible accountant. But, I'm a good sales guy. That's what I did. So I came up through the sales route. And an aptitude test would determine that. Did that answer it?
How about development in terms of you've done a lot of acquisitions. Okay. Talk a little bit about your integration and then growing internally, because I think with acquisitions there's typically more of a get rid of folks, get the synergies, and then after you've gotten all those synergies, what about the folks who are left? Are you
That's a great point.
Doing more development?
I'm pleased to say that with only one exception, in every deal we've done, and our first deal we did in Canada 9 years ago, even before we spun, we were doing it, management's there. The management from, in that case, CIBC Bank in Toronto, management team's still there, the Global Payments employees, and they have made a lot more money, they've risen through the ranks, they've taken bigger jobs, so I'm very pleased to see that. Now, however, we did a worldwide employee survey, our first ever, with a company called Connextra, and it came back pretty good, except for one thing. People said they want more opportunities, and they want more opportunities for internal development. So your question, quite frankly, hits in an area that we really need a lot of improvement on. So, here I am thinking, gosh, we're doing a great job of that. I see people getting promoted. We're keeping people. Turnover is very low. But our employees are saying, I don't think I have enough opportunities. And I don't think I'm getting enough training that will equip me to take advantage of those opportunities. So we as a management team gave everybody targets. And they're going to be graded on it. It's part of their bonus structure. We're giving them money to make it happen. HR is all over it. And we're going to, when we do the next survey, we're going to say, are we doing better? I think we have time? Okay.
Besides listening to Jane, what else informs your decision making, especially externally? Who do you listen to? Who influences you? What books do you read?
Wow. Well, I read as much as I can get my hands on. I have a bookmark that says, "Here's where I fell asleep." Because I lay on my bed, I read 2 pages, and I wake up and it's on my chest. But when I'm on airplanes, and I read a lot of business periodicals for our industry, and I read general stuff. I read some business books. I did a lot more when I was younger. I had an opportunity. I was a big believer. I know it was hokey, but I used to listen to all those motivational tapes. And all the guys, when I was at Citi and at Chase, both, all the guys I worked with would make fun of me. I can't believe you listen to Zig Ziglar. Oh my God. But, it worked for me. Eventually I was running that group. So I'm a big believer in that. I wish I spent more time doing it. Now, in terms of one of the really, really nice things, and the truth of the matter is most CEOs would probably work for zero because there's so many benefits to this job. And one of them is you get to do things like I did last night. I mean, to sit next to Richard Anderson, who is a very cool guy from Delta, and to sit next to Phil Kent from Turner, and Rick Smith, who I'm a big fan of. Equifax is here. That's because he's outsourcing it, I think. And let that be example, and any of you have missed this meeting, okay? So one of the real advantages is you get to listen to a lot of things that they are facing. And I talk a little bit, but I try to listen more, and they're very bright. I got invited to have lunch with Hillary Clinton with the president of New York Stock Exchange on Monday. Now, how cool is that? 10 CEOs sit down with Ambassador Clinton, with, what's her title? Secretary Clinton. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask her what her husband would have done in that case. Kidding. Just kidding. And I'll say they mistranslated it. I didn't really say that. But So I have a chance to sit with a lot of people who, we talked about Dennis Lockhart. I played golf with Dennis a couple weeks ago. He's very cool, and the stuff these guys are dealing with. So I try to be a sponge, keep my ears open, and I take advantage of every opportunity. Actually, I can't go Monday, unfortunately, because I just can't. You can't do them all, but when I can and I get a chance to learn, I do that. Because you never stop. I'm 57. I mean, I know a lot more than I did when I was 47. And, I'll probably know more when I'm 67. I won't look as good. I'll be a little like, but. Do we keep going? Is that it?
Yeah, I think in order to keep us on schedule, we need to break. So can you come back at 9:15? Please thank Paul.
Thank you. And thank you all. It was a real treat. It was great questions. And, you guys really are kind of the point of the spear. So God bless you all and good luck.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jake Amsbury, Securities Counsel, UPS.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks. And I'll say as a securities lawyer, the next time someone asks me to do one of these panels, I will find out whether Paul Garcia is going to go before us or after us, because I don't think that I can be as entertaining as Paul was, but I do believe that our two panelists will be at least as informative as he was. To your right is Pat McGurn, who is Special Counsel at Risk Metrics Group. And like many of you, I've heard Pat speak a number of times over the years, and I'm always impressed with how much more I know when I walk out of the room than at the time that I walked in. And I have to admit that before we spoke earlier this morning, until I spent some time with his bio, I really didn't have an appreciation for just how varied his background was. But it does make sense to me now in taking a look at it, given his policy-oriented approach to corporate governance. Pat has served as a congressional staff member. He was a department head at the Republican National Committee, and he served as a lawyer in private practice. He's a member of 4 bars, including California, the District of Columbia, Maryland, and the one of which I'm most envious, the U.S. Virgin Islands.
I actually practiced there. So.
I can't imagine that there's anyone in this room who isn't familiar with Risk Metrics Group, but I'm sure that Pat, over the course of the morning, will tell us a little bit more about his company and what's going on there. To Pat's right is Ron Schneider, who I've known for several years. He's Director of Business Development at BNY Mellon Shareowner Services. And I can tell you that Ron is one of those people who, whenever I have a particularly esoteric proxy question, Ron is one of the first calls that I make. And thus far, he has had the correct answer pretty much off the top of his head, and he's been a valuable resource to us here at UPS. And again, one of the interesting things about doing presentations like this is you do tend to learn a little bit more about people that you thought you knew something about. Ron has managed over 1,500 proxy solicitations and 200 tender or exchange offers, I think demonstrating that he does have clients other than UPS. He has extensive experience in a variety of facets in this industry, having worked at the Financial Relations Board. He's done some consulting with Broadridge, and he's held a number of positions at a variety of major proxy solicitation firms. So I think we're fortunate to have both of these gentlemen with us today. There's a lot of information contained in the 2 brains that you see in front of you. I have some material, and we've come up with some topics that we'd like to cover this morning that I know that both Ron and Pat would be interested in, to the extent people having this be an interactive session. There are still microphones in the 2 aisles, so if you have a question, if there's something that we don't cover, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. If I don't see you, I'm sure someone will let me know that you're out there. So please welcome Pat McGurn and Ron Schneider. And so I suspect that nearly everyone in this room over the course of the summer has spent a good bit of time trying to anticipate proxy access and the effect on his or her company as this proposal moves forward. By proxy access, what I mean is the ability of our share owners to directly nominate directors in the company's proxy statement. And so what I'd like to do is start with that topic. Before we got out here, Pat lost the coin toss, And so I'll just go ahead and start with you, Pat. Do you think that proxy access will be adopted in time for the 2010 proxy season? And if so, what are some of the changes that we can expect to see from the rules as they were originally proposed?
Yes, I do think we'll see proxy access in some form. I think there's pretty much 100% chance of that. What we don't know yet is exactly what form it's going to take and when exactly it will be effective. I think for those of you who may not have touched this debate before, and I'm going to boil it down to its essence, but it allows significant shareholders to put their nominees on your company's ballot right next to the board's own nominees. So it effectively creates a contested election on the company's proxy ballot. From an investor perspective, that significantly reduces your cost of conducting such a campaign. And I think it also gives you somewhat of an imprimatur that it's not a dissident campaign as much as it is an additional person or persons running for seats on the board. But when you think about it, it's really the first time if we see an access model put into place across the entire corporate landscape that investors on a single ballot will have a meaningful choice where they can say, well, there's eight seats open and there's basically 10 candidates running for those 8 seats, I think. And so it does open the prospect of incumbent directors actually losing the election and therefore being forced to leave the board unless a board decides to expand its size. I think there's 2 ways that we're going to see it. I think the first way is a way that we've seen it in some instances in the past, and that's by shareholder resolutions. In this case, more than likely binding bylaws. A number of jurisdictions, including Delaware, have already changed their statutes to allow investors to offer binding bylaws, opening up the door to access at their firms. I think, but from time to time, the SEC has also considered adopting a universal rule that would allow access at every public company, regardless of whether they're domiciled. And so it wouldn't be a resolution on your ballot asking you whether you're going to create an access structure. It would actually open the door to access itself. I think those are the 2 proposals that the SEC put out for comment.
The comment period closed a while back. I think the SEC got about 550 comment letters on the topic, I think, and it was a mixed bag. As you might imagine, a lot of corporate issuers and others were either adamantly opposed to the proposal or advised significant changes in it. A lot of investors agreed with the proposal, some as proposed, others are really seeking tweaks. And the only votes that really matter in this case are 3 of the 5 commissioners, because that's all you need at the end of the day to formally approve a mandated access across the board. I think it's a given that if they don't adopt the mandate, they're going to allow shareholder proposals in on this particular topic, given the change that we've seen in state law. If I had to guess right now, I would guess that we will see the universal access rule adopted. That is, it would mandate it for all public companies. But I'm not sure whether we'll see it kick in place for 2010 or for 2011. The way that the dates are hitting now, there's a tentatively scheduled public meeting of the commission on November 9th, I think, and most people are anticipating that if they hold that meeting, that they'll make a final determination on that issue. If they do so at that point in time and actually formally adopt a rule, given the publication standard that they have to meet, chances are the rule would be in place in time for proxy season major, I think. But November, as you may well know, is also the time, one, when shareholder proposal deadlines are hitting for April and May meetings, which is the majority of companies. And it's also, interestingly enough, the very tail end, because it's a huge disclosure window that's provided for under the SEC's rule change proposal for actually offering up a a nominee under the broad access rules. The way they've done it, it basically creates about a 120 to 150 day notice period that investors have to meet. So even if they adopt the rule and it's finalized, it may be too late for many companies to actually see those nominees coming onto their ballot, even if the rule is open to it at that point in time. And so that could mean either way that it slips to 2011 effectively for most companies, because the rule could be in place, but if the deadline's already passed for shareholders to offer a nominee who would make it onto the ballot, it's a fait accompli at that point in time. I think if we don't see those on the ballot, and it's the SEC, and I think they may belt and suspender this by also allowing shareholder proposals, bylaws on the topic that would broaden or somehow widen the ability of access to occur at the meetings, that they may allow bylaws to be submitted as well, certainly under state law. That's something that either the board or shareholders can do at this point in time. So we may see this interesting sort of double-tiered process this year of seeing some shareholder resolutions on the ballot, plus having this federal rule lingering around.
Ron, do you get the sense that institutional investors are particularly inclined to take advantage of this rule?
Definitely, and some, we've heard from directly. We work for CalPERS from time to time when their targets are not clients of ours. They're obviously a supporter of this. TIA-CREF has said publicly in a number of forums that, for several months now, they're expecting the rule to be in place, and they're planning, given the tight timing for implementation, if it's available this year, and they're talking to other investors. A large holder like, CREF is fielding calls from activists that don't own many shares that would need to piggyback on their shares, or another, mainstream investor to meet, ownership guidelines, and they're judging, which of these other investors would we team up with? What companies would we seek to target? What would be the criteria? What would our director nominees look like? Where would we get them from? So, much like companies are discussing this in these kinds of forums, investors are discussing this amongst themselves for months. So I think they're assuming they're going to have this empowerment in some form of another. And in fact, if in terms of will they use it, if you consider that, on average, some years maybe 100, or more or less, traditional proxy fights where the dissident, has to bear the traditional cost and do the heavy lifting of printing and mailing their own materials and postage and all those things, including the reported $10 to $15 million that Bill Ackman spent at quite unsuccessfully in terms of vote results at Target. If you then, basically remove the economic hurdle, which is, the primary thing keeping a lot of people back from waging board contests, you remove the economic, hurdle, you just got to expect the incidence to go up. And in fact, recently he said that, he expects, shareholders to use this at hundreds of companies as soon as they have that ability. So I think it's coming. And while we can't predict, as Pat said, it may or may not be in place, I think you have to plan for living in a proxy access world in the context of some of the other things we're going to talk about, Rule 452, like the requirement for expanded director disclosure in the proxy. So a lot of these things work together. They're not all bad in terms of, stating a strong case for your directors. So I think you have to plan now, what would our proxy disclosures look like, assuming we might face a challenge, and we're going to actually have, for the first time, to wage a true election campaign, not just statutorily disclose, these are our nominees, plurality voting, only game in town, but assume that they're going to be challenged, and you've got to put your best face forward.
Just a couple myths, though. I don't think you'll see it used very often. I think the threat of access is much more significant than the reality of it, because of the long advance period that companies will have to look at any shareholder nominees. This gives them the ability to do what many companies have already done in the case of actual contested elections, proxy fights, and that's settle. If a nominee comes in and they look pretty good to the board and you were doing a board search anyway, a lot of companies have simply expanded the size of the board and brought additional candidates in, or if there was going to be a vacancy, actually fill that vacancy. And that brings me to the second point, which is, don't expect the quote-unquote special interest candidate. I think, that's been the sort of the argument out there, that this will open the door for the labor unions and the public funds to bring in anti-business nominees and so forth. No way. They're going to bring in the most qualified, best looking on paper candidate you've ever seen. I think I was at the board talking with them the other day, and I was looking out at 12, kind of male, pale, stale faces in front of me, I think, and saying, I guarantee they'll bring a qualified, diverse candidate against your board. Again, they're going to look what the weaknesses are in your boardrooms, target that weakness, and nominate a candidate who is virtually guaranteed to at least get significant consideration, if not a very strong vote in favor. They're not going to waste access by bringing in a candidate who's clearly viewed as being anti-corporate and will poll 5% of the vote in total, I think. And so when you're preparing for this, prepare for well-qualified candidates, prepare the board to actually consider whether discretion may be the better part of valor, and simply talking with this candidate, seeing if it might be an acceptable person to include on the board's, again, slate of candidates, rather than ending up with that pseudo-contested election.
I'd like to add, to that point, that most of them aren't going to waste it on frivolous candidates, and aren't going to gain this risk-metric support or support of mainstream and investors. Companies have to be very careful, just for the traditional reasons that investors, due to proxy advisor recommendations or on their own, withhold votes from management nominees. Because let's say you have that fresh face shareholder nominee who's withhold proof, they're pretty sure that that's not going to be an issue, and then you've got all that history and that disclosure and that long track record and the 28 plus expanding every year number of reasons you may recommend withholds from management nominees. Any reason you've got to try to eliminate now any possible reason for a withhold from one of your management nominees, because that could just instantly just pave the way. That one withhold for that withhold proof shareholder nominee is slide right in.
Yeah, that's a good segue, because I wanted to come back to Pat's example where you have 8 open slots and 10 nominees, and one of the arguments that you hear about this is that puts proxy advisory firms like Riskmetrics Group in the driver's seat in a lot of these contests. And Pat, I know that you all haven't published your policies yet for 2010, but I'm curious as to how you are going to well, I guess first if you could comment on the power concerns there, but then could you speak to how you think some of the proxy advisory firms would go about, if they are going to make recommendations in that situation, what sort of factors they might look at?
Sure. We went out and asked our clients and actually corporate issuers a lot of questions in our off-season survey this year about a world with proxy access in place as to how they would operate. Interestingly, we got a very strong sentiment from our institutional client base that they will do basically what Ron said before. They'll take a look at the incumbent directors, run through their normal equation of looking, are there any opportunities for voting against or withholding, and then and only then will they likely consider any shareholder-nominated candidates who are also on the ballot. So it is a double whammy there. I think they can, if there's going to be a significant no vote against one or more of the directors, I think that's going to increase the likelihood that those investors will vote or cast their vote in favor of one of the shareholder-nominated candidates. But there's no guarantee. And in many instances, they may decide just to withhold against the board's nominee and not cast their votes in favor of the shareholder-nominated candidate, unless they feel that that candidate is well qualified, will bring additional skill sets into the boardroom, and will ultimately fix any perceived problems that they see at the company where the access contest is taking place. I think that's going to be our approach as well. I mean, what we're going to do is look for the best, in that case, 8-member board, and make our recommendations accordingly, but we will also continue to apply our standards with regard to withhold recommendations or against recommendations against the nominees who are incumbent and are running for the board. So it is definitely going to make this more of a 3-dimensional game. And that's a difference from traditional proxy fights, where typically your choice is only support slate 1 or support slate 2, or cut back on either one of those slates and support part of them. So this is a process that, frankly, no issuer has really ever gone gone through. I think, and so I think that both advisory firms, our institutional clients, and issuers and boards will be in uncharted waters for a while until we see a couple of these things take place.
Although you have, Pat, in the past supported the idea of proportional representation, where if a dissident-seeking minority slate, owned 5-8% of the shares, and they were, maybe they had, 3 out of 10 nominees, you might say, well, they're probably entitled to 1 or 2, assuming they had, legitimate qualifications. So, I mean, that is a principle, I think, that you've verbalized in the past. I would expect that would extend here as well.
Well, it's not a carte blanche, though. It really is driven by corporate performance. If there's long-term underperformance, and that's what you tend to see in traditional proxy fights today. You're not just targeting a company for the sake of targeting, and you rarely see strong-performing companies being targeted by dissidents for more traditional proxy contests. So, this could be different. The people may be running a candidate simply because they're not upset about performance, but instead they're upset about a governance concern. And that does change the equation a little bit. And so I don't think there's any guarantee. Clearly, share ownership and that idea of proportionate representation is something we would look at. But that goes more to the fact that the nominees, under the way the rule is written now, can nominate up to 25% of the seats on the board of directors. I think that number will hold firm. There may be some changes in the submission thresholds and the ownership requirements for people looking to take advantage of access, but I think that 25% number will probably hold. So that could mean in any given year you could have multiple shareholder-nominated candidates appearing on the ballot.
Okay, because I know we could spend all morning on proxy access, what I wanted to end with, if we could get 2 to 5 ideas from each of you as to what we, the people in this room, can do to get ready for proxy access, assuming that it is going to happen next year. What should we be looking at? What should we be doing with our bylaws, our corporate governance guidelines, our nominating committee charters?
I mean, a couple quick ones. I mentioned before, though. I mean, give serious thought. Take a look at the candidate. Don't knee-jerk oppose it just because a shareholder nominates the candidate, and spend some real-time vetting and looking at whether this person could be a valuable addition to the board. It could be, frankly, free executive search work here that's been done for you, because a lot of the activist institutions are indicating that that's how they're going to find their candidates, or frankly using some of the same search firms that many of you would end up turning to. I think do the risk analysis on your own board. Who's the weakest link or links in that particular boardroom, and assess where you may be vulnerable and try and eliminate those vulnerabilities. Take a look at your shareholder list, something that you guys look at constantly. I spoke with a board on Tuesday at their board meeting, and they were a $1 billion plus company, so they're under the SEC's rule as it's written right now in that 1% for 1 year category. And I looked down their shareholder list, and there were more than 20. I stopped counting at 20 investors that didn't even have to aggregate their holdings to be over that 1% threshold. So that was immediately opening the door to potentially 20 different large institutions in any given year at that particular company offering their own shareholder nominees. I think, and so that's quite a few to keep track of. But that it pushes once again the idea of reaching out to those significant shareholders to make sure that they don't have any problems that could potentially lead them to again target your company with a shareholder nominated candidate.
Ron.
Echoing a couple of points that Pat made, and there's some of this is contained in this article, which was in the. We sent it to clients back in April, so it's written kind of prospectively, but do that internal board checkup, evaluate, how where might there be perceived gaps or deficiencies that a dissident could seek to fill, and fill those first, okay? If your business has changed, your global footprint expanding, as we just heard previously, perhaps one or more directors with, global experience, makes a lot of sense. And maybe you're heading there, but maybe you want to get there a little faster than you would have otherwise. So look at yourself the way through the prism that a skeptical dissident might be, and try to plug those gaps. Also, engagement now with investors. A lot of those 1% holders that Pat mentioned, they're long-term, mainstream investors. Many of them you have great relationships with on the portfolio manager side, but you know that they're not the principal voters. But some of the voters, you might want to get to know. So if you're IR, collaborate with the corporate secretary, vice versa. More and more companies are doing a bit of proactive engagement to develop relationships now in the off season with these, not knowing what's going to be on your proxy agenda. Because when Fidelity owns 7,000 stocks and Vanguard 5,000 and so on and so forth, and 2/3 of them have meetings in a narrow window. And many of them are open to talking to issuers, but they just can't do it during that compressed season. You develop a relationship with them now, they're much more likely to pick up the phone when there's 5 lines ringing at that time, and that can be very important. And if it's an indexed investor, passive investor in IR speak, well, they're obviously not passive voters, so meeting the governance head, someone in the proxy voting area now, could be your only real point of contact. So build those bridges now because they may pay off in the spring.
And don't just tick down the list and say unlikely to offer shareholder nominees. Don't forget, one person can offer it. You're worried about everybody else supporting them as well. So again, it's not just good enough to simply go through and say, well, this particular mutual fund isn't likely to offer a candidate. You want to make sure that if a candidate is offered, that they're not winning the support of that investor.
And by the way, on this engagement, think about outside director participation in that. All companies aren't comfortable with that yet, I understand, but if the ultimate issue is going to be, are we as shareholders appropriately represented by the current board, who's best to say, these outside directors are, truly independent, engaged, and qualified? Management saying we think they are, or the director themselves, so that investors can make that determination themselves. And as strange as it sounds, we actually a couple of months ago worked on a project for Gazprom. They're a client of the Bank of New York's Depository Receipt Group, and they had an independent nominee, Valerie Musin, running for the board. And through the company, he contacted us and said, I'd like to get out and meet some real investors, let them meet me before we're in the proxy stage. I want them to kind of know who I am, so I'm not just something on paper. We introduced some of the governance heads in U.S. as well as in Europe, and he ultimately, Riskmetrics recommended in favor. He ultimately was elected. I'm not saying his proactive engagement was the reason for that, but I guess my broader point is if they can actually do it in Russia, I think we can certainly do it here. And I think now with these circumstances, focus on boards, potential competition for available board seats, I think now more than ever is when you have to tell your best board story, and I think those independent directors should be part of telling that story.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a fair point. And not every director can do it, but where you do have a director that's able to get out and talk to people in that regard, we've had some success with that.
I think especially
with shareholder proposals.
Committee chairs, especially. I think in selecting the chairs for audit, comp, and nom governance, I think it's probably a good idea to make sure those people have a little bit of time available for a roadshow or some calls are necessary. If an issue pops up, they can be very persuasive. I can tell you there have been a number of instances where I think we were ready to make negative recommendations until we had an opportunity to hear it directly from the director themselves, I think, and they were able to, again, turn our analysts' opinions around.
And if you can't turn Riskmetrics' recommendation, that kind of direct relationship engagement, that's the best mitigator of their, as the topic came up, proxy advisor influence. So, these investors own so many stocks that it can only put so much resources into proxy voting. Unless you stand out in their minds and tell a story in a way that they can understand it, they're going to default to their standard voting policies or outsource the voting. It's just what they do.
Okay. The SEC recently approved the New York Stock Exchange's proposal to eliminate broker discretionary voting in certain director elections for most meetings after January 1st, 2010. And Ron, you and I have had some conversations around this topic. There's been a lot of hand-wringing over this proposal, and I'm curious as to whether now that it's happened, whether that angst was justified, and what the real-world effect on issuers, particularly those with big retail bases, you think will be, Ron?
Okay, I mean, for most companies, and as you said, it really is all about your ownership profile. First of all, it's not going to affect quorum as long as you have auditors on. That's not to say that in the future, I mean, there's a steady erosion of 452 going back to 2003 when sub 5% requests for replenishing equity plans, those were no longer discretionary. So it's a trend, and it could easily extend to auditors and other proposal types. But right now, 90% of companies, and this is up from like 40% 7, 8 years ago, put auditors on the ballot. Well, now, it's not going to affect quorum. Some brokers on their own over the last 2-3 years have stopped issuing discretionary votes or going to proportional voting. So only about half the brokerage firms as of this past year were still giving the full traditional, the uninstructed all goes for management. And investors and proxy advisors and other commentators have been looking through the discretionary vote for several years when there was close votes on, a director withholds on Yahoo and Washington Mutual 2 years ago, where it appeared directors, especially with majority election standard, got elected. Then, commentators published, it was a broker non-vote that put you over. So 2 more nominees at WAMU would not have been elected. Ultimately, they did resign. So effectively, I think it's been gone for a couple of years anyway.
But this is all an environment where votes against directors have been on the rise already. If you're looking at stats for this year, about 10% of all nominees are above the 20% no vote line already today. We're still tracking returns from this proxy season, but before all is said and done, there's going to be probably at least 100 candidates for various boards, around 50 companies or so, where they failed to win majority support. Very few of those companies actually had full-blown majority voting rules in place, but those are on the spread as well, and they get supermajority support now on average when they appear on the ballot. So again, the director election is becoming more contentious. And yes, if you're in the 90% plus club where all your nominees are getting 90% plus, the broker vote rule change will make zero difference to you, assuming you can still get quorum in the door. If you're in the 40% plus opposition club, however, it gets dicey at that point in time. The votes can be very close, and the change in discretionary broker voting can potentially act as a swing vote in that case. It's difficult to do sometimes, but usually at least you can back of the envelope pro forma your numbers from last year and previous years to see what the impact of the elimination, just assume that they'd all go against you and run the worst case scenarios. But to date, I've looked at a bunch of close elections at S&P 500 companies sort of in the 40% plus opposition range, and those where I could factor in, to the extent the disclosure allowed for it, broker voting. I haven't seen one yet that would have been swung, would have been swayed, I think, except, and this work was done by AFSCME, the election at Citigroup, where there were a lot of broker votes for a variety of different reasons, but it actually could have swung, and this is assuming all the broker votes went against management. One of the directors from 29 to above 50% opposition, just with the elimination of broker votes in that situation. So the worst case scenarios are out there for some firms, and the smaller you are, the bigger the impact that this is likely going to have for you. I think, as Ron said before, high institutional ownership typically means that it's going to have much less of an impact, I think. But it's going to be there, and it's coming into an environment where what you could see year to year is the interplay between the 2 issues we've talked about. One year there's a high withhold against directors. The next year that's going to be a magnet for a shareholder out there who wants to offer a candidate, because what's better than running your own nominee at a company where nearly 50% or 50% plus of the shares were withheld or voted against those particular nominees. And so I think a lot of times you're going to see this in a multi-year progression where it almost becomes catnip at that point in time for some of the activist institutions to follow those voting results and come sweeping in behind them.
By the way, when on July 1, even preceding that, that single event caused more companies to spontaneously call us to ask just that question: what would our vote this year have looked like had this been in place? And a couple of tips: it's easy to figure out if you had a routine and a non-routine proposal. It's the difference in total shares represented there. If you only had 2 routine proposals, you can still get data, and Broadridge shares it with us when we request. I see Sid in the audience, hello. Because even if they issued the discretionary vote on behalf of their broker clients, that still did that. Others were saying don't issue it. Others were saying proportionate. they know what the underlying instructions were, and so they can tell us that. So, you can learn what the impact, was this year. And many companies are asking that question. And those of our clients that actually had their own mind of it were within 1%. Okay, so they were all. Now, what you don't want to do is look at your DTC list and add every broker position and say that's the impact, because that's wrong. They weren't all issuing the discretionary vote. Some, there was, 20 to 30%, were actually, issuing instructions. A lot less under notice and access, as we learned from the first year or two. So, that would way overstate the degree of it. Of the clients that we looked at, and there weren't any really tiny companies, but it ranged between 5 and 15% would have been the takedown on the active director vote. So most companies are somewhere in there, but it's easily determinable.
A couple of months ago, the SEC issued 137 pages of disclosure on corporate governance proposals, many of which I think by the people in this room would have been viewed as recently as the beginning of last year as unthinkable. And I want to get into some of those specifics, but before we did so, I thought it might make sense to get a little philosophical here and sort of talk about how we got here this quickly. And I know that when you read the introduction to the rule, there's some discussion about the financial meltdown in September of last year, but if you could speak a little bit to what, if any, the tie-in is between the financial meltdown and these governance proposals, and what you think may be at issue here, and where we, how we got here so quickly.
I mean, clearly corporate governance was a huge issue in the last national political campaign. I think, the meltdown of the markets was occurring during the course of the campaign, and I think clearly politicians saw, given the ownership nature of society that we've created here in the U.S., that these issues have real traction today. The poll numbers for corporate America and for our clients, for the financial services industry, have never been worse. Trust levels are horrible. I was at a meeting the other day where we were talking about some of the survey data, and politicians now rate better than CEOs of public companies do, and business leaders. I think journalists fare better, lawyers fare better. I think so. This is not good. I think it was interesting to hear Paul Garcia talk before. I wish more CEOs would come out and speak out. I think the problem is a lot of senior executives have gotten sort of the bunker mentality. If you stick your head up out of the foxhole, it may get shot off. So there's been silence from the business community, except for some of the lobbyists and so forth. And I think that vacuum has allowed this tide of calls for regulation and legislative change to come in this area. Clearly, the Obama team was swept into office on a promise of putting reforms in this area. They have a solid voting control over both houses of Congress, and they have a 3-seat majority at the Securities and Exchange Commission today. So, I think it's very likely we're going to see a legislative package come through. We're going to talk about some of those issues later on. And I really think that a lot of what the SEC has proposed, both on access and these other disclosure changes, are going to be adopted largely as proposed, and so I think it's frankly almost too late to turn back the tide on some of these things, although I think there can be some change on the margin in response to some of the comments that have come into the commission.
One of the proposals in this release requires additional disclosure about the qualifications of directors and director nominees. And I'm curious as to whether both of you could give us an idea of how you'd suggest that as we start to enter into proxy season here and dust them off from last year and begin to take a look at those, how do you think the people in this room begin to make the case to our investors that the directors that we anticipate showing up in that proxy statement and on that ballot are the ones that our investors should vote for?
I'd like to start with that. I think a big mistake companies make is continuing to follow all the rules and only follow all the rules and view the 14A as just a minimal disclosure document. Obviously, its requirements are expanding all the time, and the SEC has said we don't know if we're going to get it right. We don't know if this additional information is really what investors want, but we're going to do something, okay? So, while certainly, you got to still comply with the expanded requirements, but if you really want to know if your messaging is meeting the mark, and that's your investors, and you're not just satisfying the SEC and the proxy advisors, you got to talk to your investors. Ask them what they're looking for. Maybe it's a lot simpler, okay? In the case of compensation, maybe it's just a matter of clearly stating how your comp philosophy, programs, and administration tie in with and support the business model and efforts to grow shareholder value, and make that story very clear. And if you can do that, nice and sweet, you have to have all the other expanded disclosure, you'll probably have success, and that's the best way to get investors to support you and not default to standard voting policies or proxy advisor recommendations. And now, with the likely expanded director, like I'm saying, assuming, as we I think all said, assume we're going to be, whether we are or not, in a proxy access world, you're going to want to do that anyway. So, you should take a look at that now. But before you just do it and guess at what your investors need, why don't try asking them? And it sounds like a lot of companies are doing that more frequently, and I just have to encourage that, not as a few years ago that might be looked at as a nice namby-pamby, nice to have. I think it's a critical risk mitigator against unforeseen surprises, because investor expectations are escalating all the time. They're not bounded by regulatory requirements, and so how are you going to know what they are? You're going to get that report card when they ultimately vote on it. Wouldn't that information, like, oh, gee, you changed your policy, or, oh, you really focused on that this year, we didn't know. Wouldn't that information be more valuable, now while you're planning than later on when you're just doing a postmortem?
Pat, what do you think the risk here is, that if we don't begin to do something like that you start to see third parties move in to fill the void as to what constitutes a good director? And then, I guess secondarily, isn't what we're talking about really who is in the best position to determine what a particular board of directors needs at a given moment in time?
Yeah, this is definitely part of the SEC's disclosure package that your company should not be sleeping on. I mean, this is one that, to me, it's one that could have a very significant impact. For those of you not familiar with the rule, it calls for explicit disclosure as to the specific skills, attributes, experience, or qualifications that each of your directors has for service on your company's board. So that includes industry sector, other issues that come into play, and as currently written, for their committee assignments as well. So if they're on the audit committee, financial related background, compensation, what qualifies them in particular to serve in that functionality, governance, nominating, any other committees that you have. I think this will have a slow burn on it, a long fuse, if you would, but eventually I think this will be a major tool for targeting for folks bringing access nominees or in people making their vote determinations on withholding or voting against particular directors. I think they'll be looking for gaps, holes in the disclosures, or a very attenuated disclosure. Well, they serve on the comp committee because they were a CEO of a major company. I wouldn't put that in your proxy statement. I think that's one of those things that is not going to be particularly helpful or informative to the shareholders. And so, look for this sort of develop. We're going to be fascinated to see exactly what companies disclose this year. One side part of this is that it's forcing you to disclose former directorships, even for companies that are defunct. And so this brings, and we surveyed our clients this year on, are you going to hold service on the board at Lehman and Bear and Wachovia and WAMU and these other companies against directors? And for the first time, we started getting some pretty significant feedback from institutions that, yes, they're willing to look back and hold directors accountable for things that happened at other firms where they served on boards of directors as being an incident of poor stewardship, I think, and so watch for that part of the disclosure as well, because it's sort of a reminder that'll be in the proxy statement now of potential past problems.
We've already mentioned say on pay a little bit. It came up briefly. And do you think, Pat, that we're going to see the same focus that we've seen in recent years on some of these say on pay proposals, and what else can we expect to see in 2010?
Yeah, say on pay, it looks like if there's going to be a federal mandate, and we still think that there will be, that it will take place in 2011, not 2010. I think the way that the House passed the legislation, Barney Frank's legislation, was with a implementation schedule that said the SEC has 6 months, up to 6 months to write the rules, and then when they finalize the rules, they'll be effective 6 months after that date. However you do the math, starting from a couple weeks from now, which is the earliest that Congress would certainly take final action in this regard, pushes it well beyond the proxy season this year. One caveat there, Chris Dodd, Senate Banking Committee, was the author of the provision that required it at the last minute for the TARP companies last year, I think. And so there is a history, a track record, if you would, of the Senate putting provisions in place without giving the SEC adequate time to write any regulations behind them. If you may recall, TARP recipients were required to do it when they had meetings on or after December 15th of last year. So until that sort of December 15th date passes, you can't really breathe completely easy yet, but it looks for now, at least, if there is a mandate, and we still think there will be in connection with the adoption or the approval of the broad financial regulatory legislation that's coming down the pike, that'll be for 2011. Bad news is that means we're still going to see a ton of shareholder proposals on the topic, likely coming in to corporate hoppers for the 2010 proxy season, I think, and they're getting increased support, and given the likelihood of the legislative mandate, we're guessing those will jump over the barrier and start getting majority support on average when they show up on ballots next year. We're already seeing a lot of companies at least questioning whether it might be smart to voluntarily adopt Say on Pay for 2010, especially where they have compelling issues related to compensation. Because the alternative for investors, if you don't have a management Say on Pay on the ballot, which again, don't forget is an advisory vote, not a binding vote, is to vote against members of your compensation committee or your entire board. Well, you've got this arbitrage now. Broker votes, for the most part, are being allowed on Say on Pay. Broker votes coming out of the equation on director elections next year. So it's actually a tactical advantage to you because broker vote can actually help you on the management proposed Say on Pays, where they're no longer going to help you on the election of directors, I think. And just generally the optics. I wouldn't want to stake my career on telling my directors that they shouldn't put an advisory vote on the ballot and have one of my comp committee members get a 50% withhold or against, vote against them come their meeting date, I think, because one could kick into place a majority voting rule. The other one, again, is simply advisory. And what we've heard from most investors is it's going to be a yellow card, red card approach. In other words, if you have a problem with compensation and a management proposed Say on Pay resolution is on the ballot, that's where they'll focus their attention unless there's some awful problem, and then they'll belt and suspender it. And only if that problem isn't addressed will they, in year 2 then, vote against members of your board of directors or your compensation committee, I think. And so I think there is some strategic, some tactical advantage in putting a management proposed Say on Pay resolution on your ballot for 2010 before, as I said, this mandate likely goes into effect. But we're not necessarily holding our breath, expecting a lot of issuers to do that.
But I do have clients that have told me they are considering that, and they are going to bring that up at upcoming board meetings. And they haven't, some of them just, I think, said it as, kind of a best practice and get ahead of things. But a couple of points you raised, I really want to, highlight. First of all, based on last year's, results, and Pat circulated the shareholder proposal voting results. It was the outliers that really got, the really high votes. None of the management proposals, failed. Okay, most of them got an average of, 90%. So you might say, well, gee, if we don't have any big problems, chances are, we're pretty safe. We'll get a good vote. I would say the companies that do have potential problems are the ones that really should consider putting it because, number one, it's advisory. Number two, it's a two-step process. You get the advisory vote. You have a year to, cure the underlying causes. It's a pressure release valve where otherwise they may they'll use other tools, okay? Focus on your board of directors. And, you put in the likelihood. You got to look, I'm not looking at this philosophically. I'm looking at it pragmatically, in context. Lack of broker voting support. Assume there's a proxy access environment. Director withholds really matter a lot. Anything you can do to siphon discontent away from that director withhold is something you should consider.
Let's talk a little bit about the SEC's proposal on leadership structure, where they're looking for some additional disclosure and justification for the leadership structure the company's chosen as it relates to the chairman and CEO positions. There are a number of commentators out there making the case that the SEC appears in this and some other contexts to be using disclosure as a tool to drive certain types of behavior. Some of these commentators go on to say that this has backfired, for example, in a case of the disclosure of performance targets that came up a couple of years ago, where the SEC wanted to see performance target disclosure in the CDNA, and a number of companies in their incentive comp plans moved away from strict pay for performance programs to more discretionary payouts. And so I'm curious as to whether there's an argument here, Pat, whether the SEC may be working against the interests of certain investors unintentionally, or how you view this particular issue.
I mean, I think there are clearly elements of the activist investor community that would love to see legislation passed that would mandate independent chairs at every public company in the U.S. I don't think that's going to come to pass. It's in a couple of the bills before the House and the Senate right now, but I think that's more been press release legislation than legislation has a realistic chance of passing. I think, and I don't see the stock exchanges doing anything on their own to change their listing standards in that regard. And so the SEC was, sitting there trying to address this issue, and the best thing that they can do is change the disclosure standard. And so what they're going to force boards to do is not to say why they don't have an independent chair, but to explain why you've adopted the leadership structure that you have adopted. I think this is going to contribute to growing support for the move over to having independent chairs at public companies here in the U.S. I think we're going to see a record number of shareholder resolutions on the topic coming in, especially at large market cap firms this year. We saw a substantial boost in support. You can see on the scorecard there, although it's dipped a little bit at one point in time. It was actually, the average had gone up a full 10 percentage points, but it's still coming in below 40% and below a lot of other issues that are out there, I think. And so, this is more one of those evolutionary than revolutionary issues, but I do think over time we will see, these disclosures, frankly, leading some of the proponents to come in and target companies where they feel there has been a poor job of disclosing the reasons why the CEO still holds on to the chairman's title. And I think we're seeing less and less these days that the use of a lead director position is sort of an automatic talisman that you have. A lead director, independent chair proposal will not get majority support. Now, the fulcrum tends to be the performance of the company. Any significant governance problems or pay problems that have emerged seem to be more significant factors in driving the vote result.
In a sense, I think we're in this area moving towards a comply or explain model rather than a prescriptive, thou must do this model, which I think is an opportunity for companies. So if you do have a classified board, if you do have combined chair and CEO, and you think that this structure is working well for your companies and your share owners, and you know that your directors are truly independent, thoughtful, and engaged, you just have to tell a better story so that shareholders can appreciate that. Otherwise, it's just so easy. I mean, classified board, that's been a black or white issue for years for most investors. Okay, a little more nuance with the lead director, as Pat said, on independent chair versus lead director. So I think it's a real opportunity for companies to defend their structure, but they're going to have to do it. Anticipate the likely questioning. Otherwise, you're going to get default voting on these issues.
And again, I think the B of A meeting from this year was instructive. Look for greater use of binding bylaw amendments. This is something that's shareholders can typically do under state law, and so it's not going to be a precatory proposal coming in calling for an independent chair, but a binding one. And the problem with the binding proposal is that's forever and all times. If you do it yourself and have a policy that says, well, we'll have an independent chair now, but the board can make a determination to change it back and use a lead director in the future, that gives you at least some meaningful discretion at that point in time. Whereas if a binding bylaw passes, your discretion basically disappears at that point.
The SEC is also looking for a broader discussion in the CDNA this year regarding the impact of risk on company compensation policies. And a number of us have been on hours worth of calls this summer, including some of the people in this room, attempting to figure out exactly what it is the SEC is looking at here. Because, outside of certain industries like the financial industry, where you do have some traders who are highly compensated for successfully taking on large amounts of risk, for how many companies is compensation-related risk really material, and what does it look like?
I mean, this is one of the head scratchers out there for a lot of companies. Financial services, you can make the instant connection. They're in the business of managing risk. Again, they have a lot of highly compensated people, quite often with open-ended compensation structures. So that link pay to risk issue is pretty clear. For other issuers, it's not that easy an exercise. And don't forget, as proposed, the SEC is requiring you in this instance not just to look at the 5 named executive officers that basically are the ones encompassed in all other issues in the CDNA, but to go throughout your organizations and anywhere where there could be pay programs that are leading to potential material risk-taking within the firm, you're expected to provide some not completely transparent. You're not going to have to name the person and how much they're paid, but you have to give some idea about the nature of the risk and then give some idea, if the company is, about how they're going about mitigating it and managing those potential risks. I think early on, year 1 and year 2, it's going to be all about showing that you have a process. What process does the board have in place to analyze these issues? And also coming up with some defensive structures, clawback provisions, having those in place, meaningful long-term holding requirement, potential holdback provisions related to short-term bonus programs, I think, and so making sure that you have that sort of risk infrastructure in place relative to executive compensation programs, I think, and then continuing over time to use the analysis process to try and identify any situations where the risk may be acute and needs that more detailed disclosure.
Seems like a very healthy process that if companies weren't doing, they'd want to do anyway, just to be comfortable that they know where their risks are, in addition to the reasons that Pat mentioned. I actually worry about another kind of risk, which I think Paul in his opening comments did touch upon, which is the risk of just hunkering down and not trying to forge forward and execute your business plan and just say, look, this is what we are. This is who we are. This is what we do. This is how we do it. This is why you bought our stock. We're executing on the plan, and tell your story and move forward, prudently based on whatever the risks are of your type of business model, your type of industry. So I'm kind of worried that companies will just kind of back off a little bit, and therefore themselves, as well as the broader economy, may not have the turnaround that it could have.
To Jake's advice before, brainstorm. If your company's not brainstorming with peers and others, I mean, everybody's in the same boat on this. I don't think this is a competitive issue as much as trying to see if maybe there are commonalities within industries, within peers that you can find. I think, and also there's a wealth, and I do mean a wealth of literature out there now. Most of the major compensation consulting firms, a number of law firms that have put out memorandum now describing not only a process to go through for assessing risk, but in the case of some of the pundits and the comp consultants, identifying red flag issues. And again, I can tell you we're going through a lot of that literature right now, and where there are red flags that everyone seems to agree on. This factor shows up in 10 different pundits' papers. I think we're clearly going to sort of add that to the checklist of items that we look at. And when we see that pay practice present, that's been commonly identified as being a problem, and we don't see it identified or discussed in your disclosure, we're probably going to ask the question, why? I mean, why do most people believe this is a significant risk factor and this particular board does not? I think education here, I think, is probably the best defense.
Yeah, Ron, I want to go back to something you said a second ago about Paul Garcia. You know, as you and I were talking about earlier, people do what they're compensated for doing, and so if more risk means more or less compensation, then presumably executive behavior is going to follow along with that. And so, you know, do you get the sense in reading this proposal that the people who wrote this view risk as something bad and to be avoided? And is that really how investors view risk? I mean, isn't that, you know, part of the definition of what investing is all about?
Definitely, but investors have to know their own risk profile, but companies have to know and disclose what their risk elements are as well. Otherwise, the two can't really come together, and you can choose what your appetite, your holding period, your horizon, your appetite for risk, but you need to know what it is you're picking and choosing from. So, I don't know what the intent. I can't define what the intent was, but I think that sending consistent messages. How IR described your company when investors initially bought into it, what the business model was. Here's how we're going to succeed. You need to be consistent, and so unless of course things have changed, and if your models change, you have to explain that as well. Otherwise, people are going to really pick on inconsistencies, either what you said then versus what you're saying now, or what you're saying now through different channels, and that's another risk to manage as well.
And to that point, to me, this regulation becomes poison if companies stop taking risks, because it has to be disclosed in some form. The only way our clients make money is if you all are taking prudent business risks, and sometimes those risks don't work out. I think what these regulations are seeking to address are risks that may threaten the health of the company, the long-term sustainability of the firm itself, simply by moving people into decision-making that may, again, threaten the life of the company itself. I think, and part of this is just showing that you have a process, as I said, in place to track these sorts of issues and to manage them, and where necessary to mitigate them. And sometimes that's as simple as saying, we have issue here that raises some risk. We've mitigated that risk by putting a long-term holding requirement, so those individuals won't see any instant benefit from simply taking a risk in year one, since the money won't be paid out until year X, I think. And so it really is just a way of making sure those risks are identified and managed.
I have not seen any hands go up during the course of the presentation, so either you all have lived up to your billing and covered the information that we intended to cover, or people wonder what it is we're talking about. So I'm not sure. I hope it's the former, not the latter. But I had one last question that I wanted to get into, because Pat sort of alluded to earlier some of the legislative proposals that are out there, and they may be more future-oriented. You have Senator Frank's bill, which includes a say-on-pay component, Senator Schumer's shareholder rights bill. But if you could quickly handicap for us where you think this legislation is headed, but also do so in the context of federalism, which is a shorthand way of saying that we've typically accepted state law as governing corporations' internal affairs, and whether there is a compelling case here to be made that federalizing corporate law will somehow improve it.
Yeah, it is an interesting debate, and it's especially raised some of the bills we're going to address at the federal level, issues like majority voting, classified board structures, independent chair issues. And they weren't going to do this by usurping state authority in these areas. They were going to use the strong-arm tactics of the federal government for Congress to prod the SEC and the SEC to prod the stock exchanges to change the listing standards, creating a de facto national law on these issues. I don't see that legislation passing. I think say-on-pay, ballot access are the two big games in town at this point in time, and most other things are going to be disclosure-based, which has been the typical standard we've seen here in the U.S. Now, the one wild card, and this was the wild card last year as well, is I mean, bonus season comes up for the financial services firms this year, and the headlines of the paper say they're being watched closely, so maybe they'll be more conservative. But, you know, we're always in this environment sort of one stone throw away from a riot breaking out. And the worst case scenario is all this legislation sitting in the hopper there. These big bonus announcements come out of Wall Street, you know, fuel some fire on Capitol Hill in the rush to recess this year, and we get some huge piece of legislation coming out, kind of, you know, Sarboxian or something else. And so, you know, I don't, handicapping it, I don't see those encroachment type provisions making it through. I think the legislation is going to focus on comp committee independence, say on pay, votes on severance proposals, which is sort of the sideline of say on pay, and not get into a lot of other issues. We may see some tweaking on things like clawbacks and other provisions, but I just don't see that major foray that was suggested when the Shareholder Bill of Rights was introduced by Schumer or the other companion legislation in the House.
I think that's it. Unless we do have some questions. We have time for questions? Okay, I guess not. I think you all did a great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Scott Meyerhoff, partner, the Intersect Group.
Good morning, and thank you for attending. Here we've had some great speakers so far. Hopefully our panel won't disappoint. My name is Scott Meyerhoff. I'm the founding partner of the Intersect Group. Intersect is a company which provides consulting, staff augmentation, and permanent placement services in the finance, accounting, and IT realm. My personal background, I've been a public company CFO a number of times. Have most of my companies that I've been with from the corporate finance organization have been very acquisitive. Those would include a company called the Intercept Group, which was sold to Fidelity National in 2004. I joined there in 1997, grew it from 20 million to 300 million during that time frame, largely through acquisitions as well as through organic growth. To prove I was a glutton for punishment, I joined a startup company in the ERP supply chain software space called Infor Global Solutions, and we grew that from nearly zero to $2 billion in revenue in 4 years. An acquisition every 4 weeks around the world. We were in 170 countries with nearly 10,000 employees after 4 years. Wanted to find a way to actually see my children and sleep in my own bed, so I chose to leave that wonderful ride. There's only so many flights you can do to Munich, Germany before you really get tired of seeing the same flight attendants. So I found myself with an opportunity to really leverage the knowledge of nearly 100 acquisitions, integrations, change management systems, conversions, Sarbox controls, dealing with in the investor relations community, helping drive shareholder value, to go ahead and really use that knowledge to build a company to help others. Intersect today has nearly 160 professionals, over $20 million in revenue 3 years from our origination. Today I would also like to introduce a couple folks that will be talking to you today. Keith Adams. Keith is a partner in the valuations group over at Deloitte. They focus on doing valuations of business and assets, and in the what do you do once you buy it, the post-merger accounting, whether that be purchase price allocations, impairment analysis, and really strategic consulting thinking around that area. We'll also be joined by Wayne Hood. Wayne is with the Bank of Montreal and Capital Markets Group as an analyst focused mainly in the retail segment. We were just talking about a number of the most notable names that he follows, whether they be Walmart, Target, and others, and he'll talk a little bit about the analyst side of the view. And then Keith Rubin. Keith is a SVP of Revell Research Group, which helps in investor communication opportunities, really the intangible value drivers of creating that knowledge. I'll turn it over first to Gene, and then we'll go ahead and have a brief presentation from each of the panelists, and then open up to questions for you as a postmortem, and hopefully then be able to bring value to you in that facet.
Okay. Hi there. Thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it. talk a little bit about intangibles, the way that we see them. All right, there we go. Talk a little bit about Revell Research Group, but just to set the stage, the context. Revell's been in the business for 19 years. All we do is investor perception research. That's it. We take a marketing research approach. We conduct about 4,000 interviews annually, and we work with a lot of different companies, but about half the Fortune 100. And the reason that companies use this type of work is because they want to get a sense of the degree to which the investment community appreciates and understands the management, the strategy, the capital deployment initiatives, communications effectiveness, etc. So that's just a little bit about why we exist. As far as the research itself is concerned, it really comes in two ways. One is custom research work that we do on behalf of public companies, and then we do very broad, general research amongst the US buy side, European buy side, etc. The idea is to understand what drives value. You see some other comments here about seeing how things track over time, etc. This discussion, what I think Revell can bring to the table, is the emphasis that's placed on credibility of management and strategy effectiveness. Just a little bit more about the methodology so that we're all on the same page with the fact that these are representative results. The studies are sampled to be representative. It's 250 to 300 interviews for the broad-based studies that we do. Custom research is maybe 30 to 120 interviews amongst the company's investment constituency audience. It is structured line of inquiry. They are telephone interviews conducted by executive interviewers. And again, the research is representative. So, messages that motivate investors today. Every single year, we do a very broad study amongst the US buy side. What this is an order of what they believe is most important. Now, it's a prompted list. It's a list that is about 12 items long and includes other things like revenue growth potential, industry, governance, innovation, dividend. What came out on top was strong balance sheet credibility, reliable cash flow, effective business strategy, and you see the sustainable margins. And I put 8 as EPS growth because it's odd to see EPS growth number 8. Now, what does today mean? These interviews were done in February, March, and April. In February, strong balance sheet was here, everything else was here. When we got into March, believe it or not, it started equalize. And as we came out of the interviewing process in April, they were neck and neck again. So management credibility, as you'll see on the next page, this is research that we did amongst the European buy side in the spring of 2008. Same exact question, and mind you, these interviews last usually about 30 minutes. A long laundry list of what drives value, where they turn to for information, what their needs are with respect to getting information from the CEO, meetings, etc. But this is the one question that I think is the staple of every one of our projects that we do broadly. As you can see, again, management credibility was very important to 75%. And what is very important? We asked them on a scale of 1 to 10. Anyone who gives us an 8, a 9, or a 10, in other words, if I ask you, did you like the restaurant that you ate at? If you give me an 8, a 9, or a 10, that means you'll probably go there again. So that's what very important means. So it is management credibility and it is effective business strategy. Not taking away any of the tangibles. The idea is how are you getting to those tangible financial metrics. That's what investors are paying a lot of attention to. Go back to 2007. This is US buy side again. Management credibility, effective business strategy. Now, attractive growth in EPS was much higher here. Incidentally, Revell has this research going back to the mid-70s. Shop opened up in 91, but Art Revell, who has since passed, was a marketing research guy who has always been involved in this type of work. And the data he bought and brought with him to Revell Research Group since the mid-70s. Earnings growth, EPS growth, has been number 1 from the mid-70s to 2001. WorldCom, Enron.com, blow up. Ever since then, management credibility has been number 1. Until this most recent study that we did, where I showed that balance sheet for that one smidget of time was at the top. And just one more example of it, again, 2005. At this point, it's just looking at trending data. But the point is, that any single time that we ask a representative sample of a US buy side or even a European buy side, what drives value, what surfaces to the top continuously? Management credibility, effective business strategy. Now, these are closed-ended questions. Holistically, I'll tell you this, that we do about 60 projects annually on behalf of individual companies. And when we ask the question of 50 respondents or 60 respondents, what are the strengths of the company? On an unaided basis, those companies that say, those respondents or those companies that get very high frequency of mention, not just management, not just credibility, but visionary, shareholder friendliness, really understands the landscape, that type of commentary usually yields the absolute best perception scores. So then, well, what is credibility? Since credibility continues to prove out study after study after study, whether you do it broadly, whether you do it on a custom basis, whether you ask it directly or you ask for strengths and they mention it. When we ask the buy side, what is credibility? On an unaided basis, top of mind, free-flowing, almost 70% said it's meeting the goals that you've articulated. Conversely, we asked a question similar to this in the CEO study. I don't have the data here. But when we asked the question of the CEOs in US, there's 152 S&P 1500 CEOs. The answer was financial performance, strong financial performance. Only about 12% said strong financial performance against the goals that I've set. Something to keep in mind. And now what I've brought forth here is some samples. I've disguised the results, but samples of custom research projects and where these intangibles score on these particular results. There's two questions on this page. The first is a list of investment drivers. And the ranking that you see here, the way that you would read it, is credible senior management. 91% of the respondents said, on a scale of 1 to 6, this is a 5 or a 6 for me when I make a decision about this company today. So on the left-hand side, you have the priority of what's most important to the investor audience for this company down to what's most important for the smallest amount of people. So credible management, very important. Strong balance sheet, also highly important, but significantly less important than credibility. On the right-hand side is performance on each one of these drivers. Again, all of this is based on perception. So credibility and strategy is most important, even in February of 2009. And then you see the performance scores where 56 and 41% of the respondents believe with conviction, yes, this company's management team is very credible, strategy is effective. Needless to say, reliable cash flow is also very important, and it got accolades there as well. That's one company, but here's another company. Again, I picked the 5 company projects that we did in a time frame of this fiasco in the marketplace. Capable senior management, reliable cash flow, effective business strategy, credible senior management. Insurance company, a little bit different, as you can imagine. During the market meltdown, it was in fact, is your money position safe? And as you can see, there were some questions around that, a lot of uncertainty. But then bringing it back to a financial company, not necessarily an insurance company. Again, you have good earnings growth potential, but that effective business strategy, capable senior management, credible senior management, no matter how you twist it, it always rises to the top. Technology, same thing. Capable, sound business strategy, incredible management, not too far below. Again, I meant to make a message here, kind of send a message, and I wanted to make sure that it's clear that it's not just the broad U.S. and European, I would say probably global markets, but it is also, no matter how you ask the question, it keeps rising to the top. Not to forget, of course, that this is a financial decision, so we do ask the question, when you're trying to understand the company's performance, financial performance, what are the most important tangible metrics that you look at? So I'm hoping that this is not a surprise to anybody, but it is free cash flow and ROI. And I don't know if I said this at the beginning, it's important to keep in mind that we only interview active investors, we don't interview passive investors. Since we're on a topic of intangibles, you could definitely put communications in there as an intangible. It's a question that we asked of the buy side 2 times, in 2007 and 2009, to ask them what they think about IR. I mean, everyone always tries to measure the effectiveness of IR, as difficult as it might be. We thought we would just ask them what they think the value is or the discount is for good IR or bad IR. Good IR, 10%, premium, bad IR, 15% discount. And then in 2009, while the premium was not added, there was a significant decrease to the paying company suffer in the eyes of the investment community if IR is problematic. What is superb IR? Transparency. Now granted, disclosure is a part of it, management access is a part of it. Those things they expect, especially disclosure, because for the most part you're giving them what you have to. But it's the disclosure, it's open and frankness, and having management deliver that message is what's most important to them. And then what is transparency? I put that in there because you guys have the handouts, just in case you want to know what the buy side thinks transparency is. And then with respect to guidance, given the fact that the world has changed, I know it's an overly used term, but I'll just use it there. It's not all about earnings guidance anymore. Rank order of importance, it is in fact qualitative insight on the strategy, followed by the financial metrics that they're looking for you to deliver on. And that is the end of my story.
Next up is Keith Adams.
Okay, so I have a few clients in the audience who have threatened to throw tomatoes, harass me, and things like that. So just to get it started off right, I'll tell a corny joke. Okay, so I do valuation work at Deloitte, like the introduction said. And so I do a little bit of work on the advisory side, helping people figure out how much to buy things for, figure out how much to sell things for. I do a lot of work for accounting on the post-merger integration side, like Scott said, helping people account for transactions after they've executed, doing purchase price allocation work, so valuing intangible assets, valuing plant assets, doing work related to impairment analysis, and that's been pretty popular lately, and we'll talk more about that later. But as a valuation guy, I'll just tell a quick corny joke. So 3 valuation guys go hunting. They go out in the woods, and they're deer hunting. And the first guy steps up, takes a shot at a deer, misses it by 15 yards. Second guy, 15 yards to the left, that is. Second guy takes a shot, misses by 15 yards to the right. The third guy jumps up and down and says, "We got it, we got it, we got it." So, there you go, Steve. I actually hit something that made it go backwards. So we're going to talk a little bit about a quick primer on valuation for financial reporting. We're going to talk a little bit about what's changed in valuation analysis for transactions. So we've got some new rules that take effect this year. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what happened in goodwill impairment analyses over the last year, or really for the 2008 reporting year. So a quick primer on financial reporting related valuation. So FAS 157 is the standard for financial accounting standards that sort of governs valuation estimates. It doesn't tell you when to value something, but it more tells you what information to use, how to develop your estimates, and then what to disclose about those estimates. It's relevant to FAS 141R, the standard that covers transaction accounting or acquisition accounting, FAS 142, goodwill impairment, FAS 144, impairment of long-lived assets, 133, derivatives, which is so much fun for everybody, and others. It defines fair value, and it actually has an assumption or a presumption that fair value is more related to an exit price than an entrance price, what you'd be willing to sell an asset or a business for, or what you'd be able to, or what you'd give someone else to take the liability off your hand. It prioritizes the inputs used. We'll talk a little bit about that. And it outlines the hierarchy used for measurement and disclosure. So in terms of prioritizing the inputs used, the standard provides a clear preference toward using observable market inputs. And they've developed a hierarchy to define observable versus unobservable inputs. Those observable inputs are called level 1. So it would be quoted prices in active markets. So your stock price times number of shares is a level 1 estimate of value. Level 2 would be the use of observable inputs in an estimate that isn't clearly observable in and of itself. So it might be pricing your company stock based on the prices of similar companies, or it may be pricing or observing the price for your stock, but not in a liquid market, in an illiquid market. And then level 3 would be unobservable inputs. So assumptions that you make in estimating value of an entity. Typically, we think of these as a lot of the assumptions that you use in executing discounted cash flow analysis. Again, the standard includes a clear preference for maximizing the use of observable inputs, and in fact, sort of, if you will, rewards you for that by requiring less disclosures about those level 1 estimates in your financial statements versus significantly more disclosures for the valuation estimates that you've developed in hierarchy 3 or using more unobservable inputs. So we'll talk more about this stuff as we move along. All right, so in valuation for financial reporting, we still use the 3 traditional methods of valuation: the market approach, the income, and the cost approach. For the market approach, pretty easy. We talked about it, mostly level 1 and level 2 inputs. So the value of your stock or the value of a similar company stock, or trying to develop indications of value of your company or specific asset based on transactions. So with business valuation, if you're valuing a private business, for instance, observing valuation multiples for guideline public companies, and then considering adjustments to those guideline public company indications for things like growth, risk, and profitability. If you're valuing, you can do the same with a guideline transaction approach, but you can also use a guideline transaction approach sometimes in valuing particular assets, like used a project where we valued NYMEX seats, and we've executed valuation using transactions where we're looking at emissions allowances and other sorts of intangible commodities. So next up, income approach. Most of us are familiar with the income approach, discounted cash flow analysis, and capitalized earnings models used to value businesses and commercial real estate. And we use multi-period excess earnings models, relief from royalty methods, and other comparative with and without methods for valuation of intangible assets when we're doing those purchase price allocations. Some of those might be for customer relationships or certain sorts of proprietary technology. We might use excess earnings models. In an excess earnings model, we try to isolate the earnings attributable to a specific asset when starting with cash flow for the whole company. We take that cash flow for the whole company and we take charges for the use of other assets of the company, for the fixed assets of the company, for the working capital of the company, and for other identified intangible assets, so we can reduce the earnings stream to the excess earnings or earnings attributable solely to the subject asset. So it works well with things like customer base and some sorts of technologies and things. Relief from royalty analysis works based on the concept that by owning a trade name or trademark or by owning certain proprietary technology, we avoid payments of royalties or license fees for use of those assets. Thus, they provide economic benefit that way. And we identify guideline transactions that include royalty rates or licensing fees and project out the savings associated with not paying those royalty fees over time. With and without methods are used for things like covenants not to compete. We estimate the value of a business with and without competition from the covenantor to determine the impact that person could have on the business if he or she were to compete with the business. And then cost approach, Cost approach valuation of assets based on the cost to recreate or replace those assets today. And we use it for business valuation, developing an adjusted balance sheet to determine how much the fair value of all of the assets are, subtract fair value of liabilities to get the fair value of the equity based on the cost approach. So we'll talk a little bit about acquisition accounting. FAS 141R, new rules that were developed or put into place this year, practically speaking, for most companies. Although there aren't a heck of a lot of transactions going on, so there aren't a heck of a lot of people that have actually dealt with this on a consistent basis yet. So some of the stuff's still evolving, and there have been some FASB staff positions issued to clarify some questions and concerns about 141R. But the main drivers and the main principles behind 141R are recognition, so recognizing the assets and the liabilities that you've acquired in a business combination transaction. Measuring those assets and liabilities at their fair value, so just simply saying book isn't good enough. And then developing appropriate disclosure around those valuations. We're only going to talk about some of the big changes, but I want to talk about some that are more important for the deal process than others. Definition of a business has changed under 141R. Short version is that in the past, you couldn't. A bundle of assets may not necessarily qualify as a business, whereas now it may. In the past, some startup organizations or some development stage companies would not have qualified as a business, and now they do. But some of the bigger ticket items we're going to talk about going to be measurement date for equity securities that are issued, acquisition costs, contingent consideration, restructuring costs, pre-acquisition contingencies. I'll mention the deferred tax assets, but I'm not an expert, so I won't talk about it very much. I'll real quickly touch on goodwill, no negative goodwill. In the past, if you were executing purchase price allocation and the analysis indicated you had negative goodwill or that the fair value of the assets that you acquired exceeded the transaction price, then you would simply allocate that negative amount on a pro rata basis to all of the assets that you acquired in the transaction, such that you fit those asset values to the transaction. Now, under the new rules, that actually wouldn't be the case. If you're certain your valuation on the individual assets is correct, you book those numbers that might exceed the transaction value and take a charge for the negative goodwill instead. Okay, so measurement date for equity interest issued by the acquirer used to be that you would measure the value of those equity securities on the announcement date. Now it's on the actual acquisition or the closing date. So the implication there is that long drawn-out transaction processes could impact ultimately the amount you recorded on your balance sheet for transactions, thus the amount that you record for goodwill and anything else that's dependent upon the transaction. So from a deal perspective, it's good, or let me say it might not be good, but it's motivation for more cash transactions and less protracted negotiation and closing periods to the extent that you can help it. Acquisition-related costs of the acquirer. Under the new rules, those are generally expensed, whereas before they were generally capitalized. So from a deal perspective, the implication here would be that folks are going to maybe do diligence a little bit later in the transaction process to manage the costs associated with that more closely. And then on an ongoing basis for highly acquisitive companies, to the extent that those activities ebb and flow, it would introduce additional volatility to financial results. Contingent consideration. So if your deal comes with an earnout, now there are requirements to actually value that contingent consideration and put it on your books determine the fair value of that contingent consideration. It may look more like equity. It may look more like debt. Usually it tends to look more like debt. And to the extent that you earn that over time or determine that you're not going to pay that contingent consideration over time, there'll be impacts to the P&L for that. Costs associated with restructuring or exit activities. So in the past, integration costs, restructuring costs after a transaction were generally allowed to be capitalized. Now those activities, consistent with diligence activities or transaction costs, generally required to be expensed. Again, it eliminates a significant benefit of some of the prior accounting requirements. Pre-acquisition contingencies. So valuation is now required for more of these, whereas in the past you didn't necessarily have to value all of your pre-acquisition contingencies. So let's just say some litigation, or there could be several other things that might result in pre-acquisition contingencies, would now have to be valued on a more consistent basis and put on the financial statements. Finally, to the extent that there are uncertain tax positions, used to be able to record those to goodwill post-transaction to the extent that adjustments were made. Now those changes will have to go through the P&L. So again, additional volatility of earnings as a result of purchase accounting. So from a deal process perspective, the high-level issues here are simply that additional volatility from earnings is a real theme throughout this standard, and there are some real changes related to valuation of pre-acquisition contingencies and contingent consideration. So from a valuation process perspective, those sorts of analyses for pre-acquisition contingencies and contingent considerations are generally executed using discounted cash flow analysis with a number of scenarios and probability weightings. To the extent that they're extremely complicated, sometimes we've seen Monte Carlo simulation used in those sorts of analyses, but we try to keep it as simple as possible. So now, goodwill impairment. So just as a quick refresher for goodwill impairment, the test is generally a two-part test. You test the goodwill in your company for impairment at the reporting unit level, not the consolidated company level, based on two steps. First, compare the fair value of the reporting unit to its carrying value. To the extent that fair value exceeds carrying value, you don't do anything else. To the extent that fair value is less than carrying value, you determine that you have an indication that an impairment may exist, and you move to step two. So in step two, you perform essentially a purchase price allocation consistent with FAS 141R and determine the fair value of goodwill that is the residual amount from your purchase price allocation. Compare that to the book value to determine the amount of the impairment. There's some tax differences in there, but that's the simple version. Last year was an interesting year for goodwill impairment analysis. We had almost a 250% increase in goodwill impairments taken over the last year. I believe the number was over 600 goodwill impairment charges were taken for fiscal years ending in 2008. The big loser or high number of transactions or charges were taken in the consumer discretionary business. And they had, I want to say, 150 roughly charges in that business. More interesting would be the value of the goodwill impairments that were taken. Last year we saw over $160 billion of goodwill impairment charges taken, and those charges ranged from very small to one particular charge that I'm aware of was $25 billion. In fact, that was an energy who led the pack with, let's see, it was $39 billion of charges in the energy industry last year. 25 billion of those was with one company. The second in this group from a value perspective, also again consumer discretionary. A lot of retail companies in that group, and as we know, we'll hear later from Wayne, there's been a lot of challenges in the retail business. We all know that. From the perspective of reviewing goodwill impairment analyses, which I do sometimes for our test clients, we have some comments that came up as common themes in our reviews, as well as in comments that we're starting to see come out from SEC comment letters as a result of the 2008 reporting season, and comments from PCAOB in prior years. So some of the common statements were reconciliation to market capitalization and for premiums for control. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Last year, the SEC, through speeches and other mechanisms, sort of let folks know that they considered it a triggering event to test goodwill for impairment to the extent that your market capitalization dipped below book value. That perception has not been changed, and it is still the perception of the SEC that we're being advised that a market capitalization below book value is an indication that you need to test for impairment. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to recognize an impairment. They're just telling you that that means you have to test for impairment. What they've also said is that when you execute your goodwill impairment analysis, we think that the sum of parts, so if you have several reporting units that you value independently in this analysis, that the sum of the parts should be reconciled to the whole. So that if you have several reporting units, the value of those reporting units, after you've executed your fair value analysis, reconciles reasonably well to market cap, but they do allow for a reasonable control premium. As we all know, control premiums are often seen in transactions, and the SEC recognizes that as well. However, they think that control premiums should be well supported. And so this is just sort of a quick example. In this example, we've got a couple of reporting units. We did fair value analysis. We tried to reconcile to market cap, and the difference worked out to be 133%. So we've implied that the value of our business is 133% greater than the market capitalization, which without support the SEC would never let fly. So it doesn't mean that you can't have high control premiums, but they're expected to be within the historically observed range of premiums, and they should be well supported. So just simply saying it's within a range isn't sufficient. Indicating why the control premium is relevant is what the SEC is looking for, and it could be by demonstrating with a combination of the following. Again, recent transactions in the industry that demonstrate a significant control premium is relevant. And then the next four items up here on my list: contingent liabilities, information asymmetry, income tax consequences from valuation analyses, and then capital structure issues. I'll call these material non-public information items. To the extent that you are using material non-public information in your valuation analysis, you need to be able to demonstrate that through work papers if requested, and through SEC comment letters if requested, why the use of that material non-public information impacts the valuation of your reporting units and thus supports your goodwill impairment analyses. And with that, I'm going to move on.
Thank you, Keith.
You know, when for those of you who I haven't met or didn't get a script, I'm a sell-side analyst with BMO Capital Markets, and what I thought I would do is maybe just tag along with what Keith and Jean just said and kind of maybe tie together, before we get into the price objective, a little bit of real life experience, because what Keith just went through, I experienced twice last year where companies had to deal with an impairment charge, and how the IR individual and even to the CFO level dealt with that was pretty bad. As a result of that, you had shorts jumping on the stock, and you had violation of bank covenants that had to be amended. So as you heard Keith talk about impairment and some of those things, you may look at it and go, how does that apply to me, and how can I use what he's saying? Is that the street, the sell side, what we saw last year were asset prices, hard asset prices declining, equity markets declining. So the natural thing as a sell side analyst or buy side people or hedge funds that went in and would have shorted these two stocks or did short these two stocks was to kind of get some idea of what kind of impairment charge these two companies were faced with. So when we were in contact with the IR person and the CFO, we constantly heard from them, we don't think we're going to have an impairment charge. So you're sitting back and you see these asset prices declining, and you know an impairment charge is coming. It's the question of degree. So for them to sit there and say that we don't think we have an impairment charge coming gets to what Gene was talking about credibility and frankness and openness. So as I deal with them now, when I talk about cash flow and all these metrics that we look at all the time, they clearly have less credibility with me and other people around, and it's going to be very hard to restore that. So if you find yourself in a situation where you've got an impairment charge or you've got something coming on, it's critically important that you understand that and be frank about it. If you don't know, say we don't know, we're looking at it, because it can put you into a situation where the equity value is declining, you've got bank covenants that get violated, you could easily default into some type of bankruptcy, during that whole process, and then you're having to deal with the shorts and explaining, why they keep dumping on our stock. So just to tie that together, that's very important what both of them said. So I'll move on to how we pick a stock price in terms of the things that we look at. Which one's forward here? It's underneath.
Your index finger underneath there.
It's hidden, okay. Okay, so looking at sell-side valuation metrics and methodologies, these are, some of the more popular things that sell-side, buy-side people look at, and frankly, you as individuals should be looking at when you're trying to value either your own stock or stocks of other companies you may be looking at investing in. The most common approach is the absolute PE, which I think everybody in this room is aware of. The relative PE, which is the relative price-earnings ratio to the S&P 500. The PEG, which is price-to-earnings growth rate. What you'll find is that people who are growth managers will tend to look at PEG ratios more than a lot of other things. So that's what that's related to. Cash flow yield, which is really the operating cash flow divided by the equity market cap. That tends to be used by people who are more value-oriented, cash flow driven, those kind of money managers. Enterprise value to EBITDA, another common metric that's used by people, not singularly, but in combination of other things is commonly used. Return on invested capital. What I would tell you is ROIC has gotten more important over the last 5 or so years than I've seen it in the 20 years that I've been doing it. So there's various ROIC metrics that you can look at. One that we put a lot of importance in is return on capital of the cash flow of the business overall, rather than just, it's really return on invested cash flow rather than just ROIC of the total business. So we're able to really gauge as they deploy that incremental dollar of capital, what kind of return they're getting off of that incremental dollar as opposed to its aggregate. Return on equity is another thing that people use, obviously. Price to book. When you think about that, that's really measuring downside risk, the way that we look at it. There's always this tendency, well, let's see where the stock can go to. But there's not a lot of, I see, work done on what's my downside risk versus my upside potential. And looking at price to book value can be a measure of that, as long as it's a pure, clean number. To the right there is discounted cash flow analysis and EVA. And I'll show you a little bit about what that means. So EVA is economic value added. You find people look at earnings yield, which is basically the earnings per share divided by the stock price. And so they'll get some idea of what kind of earnings yield the company might be throwing off. Dividend yield obviously is out there. That tends to be a metric that more value managers will look at because they're looking for dividend for some kind of downside support. These other metrics here are apply to various sectors or different industries. So you'll hear things like RevPAR, which is revenue per available room. So, and then FFO applies to the REIT industry, which are really funds from operation. There's subscriber-based metrics that people look at, or scripts-based. And then there's comparable company analysis, where we will, and I'll show you in a second, look across various sectors to see how industries are trading at. And then we'll break companies apart to see what each individual segment might look at, and then apply a multiple each of those segments to get us some of the parts analysis that Keith was kind of referring to a minute ago. Those are the most popular metrics. I think you as IR people need to understand what's most important to your company, or how people are thinking about us in each of these metrics, and importantly, how they change over time. That, I cover Home Depot and Walmart, and we used to value them on a PE to growth rate basis. As the industry's matured and the company's matured, people are looking at them on a cash flow yield basis, or other more mature metrics. So this actually ends up being a little small here, it looks like, on this graph. But what I wanted to do is maybe to walk you through, if you can see it, is how we think about putting a price target together for a stock that we may be looking at. On the buy side and the sell side, just so you're aware, people look out at least 12 months when trying to determine a price target. So usually it happens around May or June that we'd start looking to 2010 estimates and applying valuation metrics to 2010. So you may look at 2009 and say it's important, but really from an investor standpoint, they're looking well ahead of that. And most recently, with the cycle turning down the way they are, they may even be looking 3 or 4 years out trying to determine what the peak earnings power might be. But what I have here at the top is the 2010 annual earnings estimates. And so we approach valuation looking at 2010 earnings is what I'm getting to. We look at where these stocks, what their earnings growth rate might be by segment. So we've blocked that. You clearly can't see it, I don't think, particularly from the back of the room. So we're looking at the year-over-year change in earnings growth rate for the company versus the S&P 500. So what you'll typically do is you'll sit down, a money manager, an analyst, or myself will look down and say, what kind of earnings growth does this company have versus the overall market? If it has an earnings growth that's above the market, you could make an argument that you would award that stock a premium to the overall market. The challenge, though, right now, and you can't see this at the bottom, but it's the S&P 500. The market's looking for 28.5% earnings growth in 2010. That's not modest recovery. That's a hockey stick recovery, and that's what people are worried about now. Is that, the market's moved up so much in here. Is it a modest recovery or a hockey stick? Well, if you look at consensus estimates, it's a hockey stick, and so you really got to have these things really take hold. But it's the typical. What I've seen over cycles is we get enthused, we think the cycle's really going to take off, and you run the multiple up, and you get higher valuations for the overall market. So what you look at here is you're trying to find companies that will grow, as fast or faster than the overall market, and you accord them, a premium to the overall market. What I've circled down here is a company specific, though, where we've got Rona, which you would never have heard of. It's a Canadian company that's a home improvement retailer. And if you were to look at Rona at the bottom, it's trading around 11 times earnings versus the group that's around 15 times, and Home Depot and Lowe's that's trading around 17 or 18 times. So first of all, let me address Home Depot and Lowe's a second. The 17 or 18 multiple that Home Depot and Lowe's is trading at is above the 15 multiple that the market is trading at. So when you look at the earnings growth over the next 5 years, it's going to be lower than the overall market. So you may question, why are they being given such a premium to the marketplace, given the maturity of that industry, the slower growth? What you're dealing with right now is people are looking out from a cyclical growth standpoint. It's not what they'll put up right now, but it's looking at what Home Depot could put up 2 or 3 years from now, $2.50 in earnings. So they'll run that multiple up well ahead of 2010 or 11 earnings and look at valuation from that perspective. So that's the reason those two are trading at big multiples. When you look at Rona, though, you could look at that and say that stock, same industry, different. They're in Canada, not in the United States, but it looks like it's a cheap stock relative to the rest of the group, and clearly it is. But what you have to adjust for is that company has lower EBIT margins, has a lower secular growth rate. They are facing intense competition up there. So you wouldn't, because of all of those factors, you wouldn't give it the same multiple that you give Home Depot or Lowe's or even the overall market. So there's some discount that you apply to that business. So that's how we think about it. And I'll show you in a second how we come up with a target. So we're looking here at absolute multiples, relative multiples to the market, the overall group. We'll also look at enterprise value to EBITDA, where it's trading at, again, cheaper than the group overall. We'll look at the cash flow yield, what it's throwing off on the far right-hand side to try to determine, how it's attractive beyond just PE and relative PE. Okay. So another way that, and this is kind of the easiest way that buy-side, sell-side people will look at, we'll say, where has this stock historically traded at? And that's here on the left. And what I did there is highlight the line, the average multiple really from 03 through 09, and you can see it's about 12.6 times. And you could say, well, the stock should trade at its average multiple. And some may argue, well, it's traded at 17.5 times, maybe it goes back to the premium. We would argue that it doesn't go back to that premium level anymore because the growth rate has changed, competition has entered the marketplace. They're not going to put up the same kind of numbers they've had in the past. That doesn't mean that it can't trade it during a cyclical recovery back to its average multiple, which is around 12.5 times. So when we sit down and we try to develop a price target for this company, we're using 12.5 times $1.33, which comes up to a $16 price target. So that's the simplest way to kind of walk through that. On the far right-hand side, you can see that this stock is historically traded at a discount to Home Depot and Lowe's. It's moving up. We'll also look at how it's trading relative to the peers to try to figure out if that gap is going to narrow a little bit. But this is probably the easiest approach that people use out here day to day in looking at, certainly my group, your sector may have a little bit different metric that they look at. I wanted to mention this because this is a measure of downside risk, price to book. So when we put on a stock, a position on, and we say it has 10% upside based on our price objective that we just came up with, we also look at downside risk, and you should do this as an individual as well. So generally people, particularly people that are that manage risk very well, will want 2-to-1 upside to downside. So it's very hard for them to put on something that has 10% upside and 30% downside, for example. So one way to look at this is to try to measure where our downside risk is. And in this particular case, again, this is Rona. Looking back historically, if you'd have looked at the price action, the stock would have, as you see here, bottomed around 1 times book. So 1 times book is about $11.50 per share. But we got upside to 16. Not really compelling risk reward. Even though we may like the company, we may like the fundamentals and all of that, it's very hard to get a portfolio manager or an analyst to put a position on with that kind of risk upside downside. Other methods that Keith was talking about a little bit that comes maybe in M&A activity or LBO type of analysis is discounted cash flow analysis. This is done less and less on the buy side and sell side. We do it as part of our analysis, but it really takes a longer term approach. So basically what you're doing is you're forecasting out the operating cash flow of the business, discounting it back to determine what a value is. And you could see, like in this particular case, when you do DCF analysis with Rona, we came up with $16. When you do a DCF analysis, it's $46. So quite a bit, a significant difference in valuation, but that's, in many ways, that's what makes markets. The issue that when I look at this is that's great that it's got that kind of operating cash flow, but I have to be able to get a hold of it. So if I'm an activist shareholder and I see a DCF model that looks like that and I see a stock trading at 11 or book value, I'd be all over that from an activist standpoint. But you've got to be able to get your hands around that DCF if you're going to try to monetize it or that cash flow stream. Another thing that I like to put more emphasis on is EVA analysis. This is economic value added, and this really gets at the heart of, I think, is management really creating value for their shareholders, their employees over time? And so the important, without going through all the minutia of how you generate, the various margins and so on at the top. The important piece is kind of towards the bottom here, where you look at returns on invested capital that the company's putting up, and you look at their weighted average cost of capital, and you look at the spread between those two. So whenever companies are producing a positive spread or positive EVA over their cost of capital, they're creating value. And obviously, if they're not, then you really, as an analyst or buy-side person, we will obviously quiz them about what are you doing to improve your returns on invested capital. Obviously, if the returns on invested capital, more than likely their WACC is going up and there's all kinds of problems. But generally what you'll see, and we put a lot of emphasis on this, is we want positive trending spread to create positive value. And that tends to lead to a higher valuation for the stock overall. I put this in here because of where we are in the cycle. This is a graph that looks at the forward PE multiple for Walmart and Target. And I think it speaks volumes about not only where our economy is in terms of how it's growing, but how you deal as an IR person with secular changes that may be going on with your company and how you try to get a higher multiple. But if you look at the contraction in both of these companies' multiples from 98 through July, you've seen pretty significant contraction. So what it represents is really a maturing industry where we have enough Walmart stores, we have enough Target stores, consumer spending is overall slowing down, and the earnings growth rates for these companies are coming down in a material way. So as an IR person, you've got to constantly deal with, how do I explain to management the contracting multiple? How do we get a better multiple overall? And there's really no good way to explain that other than it's going to continue to go down as the multiple kind of or as the growth rate contracts more towards the market. And if the growth rate contracts more towards the market, you're going to get more of a market multiple unless you've got some reason where you think you can grow better than the overall market. What I wanted to call your attention beyond that was to call your attention to the right, where I've circled a little bit of an area there, because sometimes you may look at companies in your industry and you say, why is our stock trading here and their stock is trading above it when our fundamentals may be better and we're generating better returns or whatever may be going on. And this happened with me this past year with Target and Walmart. So you go back to 2008, the Walmart is the blue line over there to the right. It's above Target, which is below the bottom line. So what you'll find is that when you have when the cycle starts to change, it affects valuation. So last year, as people began to take cover from the earnings revisions and everything that were going in the marketplace, they began to move up Walmart's multiple that had been in a steady state of decline for a number of years. And as I think you all know or heard about, it was one of the best performing stocks, if not the best performing stock in the market overall. And on the other hand, they compressed Target's multiple because of the fear of earnings estimate revisions, more discretionary merchandise, slowing growth. So that's kind of what happened in 2008. So where are we now? As the cycle begins to recover, all of a sudden Target's multiple starts to move back up, even though Walmart is still putting up good numbers and has better returns. So you're sitting there scratching your head saying, why is that going on? And you may run into, you may run into situations like this with your own company. It's because the market is playing the cycle. You can't fight that. I know that Walmart is very frustrated about what their stock is doing versus others that are out there right now. So the only way you can fight that is that what you have to do in the case of Walmart is that you have to demonstrate that in an upcycle that you can participate as good or better than Target or others that are out there. So their apparel business has to be as good or better than Walmart. Their other discretionary businesses do as well. The reason why, people are looking for that cyclical pop in earnings, and Walmart really, at this point, don't believe, the market doesn't believe that will occur. So if you run into an event like this, I think you have to really demonstrate to the street and show them that you can, in fact, so show some kind of cyclical recovery in earnings, then you can get the lift in the overall multiple. And then finally, this gets back to, again, the cycle is that, comes back to Rona, is that, where we are right now is people are playing the early cycle, and the macro call here, it's as much a macro call right now as anything. So when I'm sitting down with buy-side people right now, our PMs, it's about, what's the macro environment look like? What stocks are going to work within that environment? It's less so about minutia of the company. It's very thematic-oriented investing right now. Eventually, as the cycle begins to have less of an upward trajectory, I think we'll come back more about the fundamentals. It doesn't mean they're not focused on the fundamentals, but they're playing this cyclical aspect of what's going on. And within that, they look at where your stock or these stocks might be in the indexes and things like that. So keep that in mind. Sometimes it's frustrating as an IR person that you've got good things going on in the company, but you're not part of the index. And these guys really, I can't tell you, more often than not now, it's about where who's in the index, how cyclical is that play, am I over, underweight that index, and how does this all fit in the macro scheme of things? So those are the things that I wanted to cover, and I think that's it for me. Scott?
Great job, guys. Let's go ahead and give the panel a great... It's rather interesting. It just goes to point out how very simple you all have it. You have to convince your CEO to be available all the time. You have to convince him to say exactly what the analysts want when he or she doesn't want to say it. You have to go ahead and tell them you're selling as hard as you possibly can to get the company in the right position, even though he doesn't want to say the right things. And all the while go ahead and get them on the road 3 weeks a month and tell them to run the company at the same time. So I don't understand why anybody in the investor relations professional world would have any type of issue whatsoever. In all seriousness, y'all have a very difficult job, and certainly in this market, it does not make it any easier for you, and certainly with the vagaries of the market and the way they've been centrified lately, it certainly opens up any number of questions and really makes you think of all the variables that go into an effective IR presentation and effective IR program to go ahead and build that shareholder value, create that confidence, create that feeling of trust within the company, and then really demonstrate it over long periods of time. Because as we've all seen, everybody says, that's great, you've done it for a quarter or two, but can you demonstrate it for the long term? And then you get to demonstrate it for the long term only to see their desires change and say, I did everything you told me we were supposed to do for a year, and now you changed your mind on the investment community. But that's all par for your course. So with all that being said, and with all the presentations here, I guess once again it just reminds me how very difficult that your jobs really are. With all that being said, I'd love to open it up for questions. We can direct to whoever you want to answer them, and why don't we go ahead and open it up to the audience for questions.
I have a question and I don't know, maybe Keith and Wayne might change to this, but we had a huge impairment in our last fiscal year. We have a money transfer business, specifically, my CEO spoke about earlier. And with everything going on in the Latin American corridor, it was ripe for the taking. And it was like almost $150 million, which was, big for our company. And I knew the analysts would not care, the investors would not care too much because they just exclude it. It's restructuring type charge, and they look at it, below the line. But I was really surprised to see that it didn't seem to impact our multiple at all. And I don't know if there were other variables that I can't see in their models that they've tweaked. And I was wondering what your experiences have been with other companies that took these huge impairment charges and how that impacted their multiple. Because our chief accounting officer was just stunned that it had no impact. And he never believed me. I kept telling him, they don't care. My guys are not going to care. Maybe they care in other companies, but what's your experience with that?
Wayne, you want to go first?
I think when you think about impairment charge, when we look at it and say, will that charge somehow violate a loan covenant? So in the consumer discretionary area, it did. So what it raises the question around was, will they be able to get waivers around this impairment charge, and for how long? So to the extent that it didn't result in a violation of covenants, then it is a non-issue. But to the extent it does, not only contracted the multiple of Macy's, for example, but it took everyone else down with it, because we were looking at across all the retailing impairment charges, and you're dealing with the banks there who had their own set of issues with debt, right, from the mortgage industry. And so, you know, I think that was the reason that we got hit more from it than maybe you, where you didn't, it didn't violate a bank covenant.
And I think to just add one more sort of perspective to that, properly communicated and to the extent that they don't happen all the time, I agree. With many of my clients, I don't see a significant impact to stock price. However, when these sorts of things aren't expected by their investors or analysts that follow the companies, and when they happen time after time after time again, to sort of tie into what Gene was saying earlier again, I think when those things tend to occur frequently and they're not communicated, I think investors sort of lack confidence or lose confidence in the management team and their ability to communicate and execute on a path that they've determined.
I think it's exactly right, because when we went through that exercise, you know, the IR person, you know, adamant about we have no impairment charge when we knew there was an impairment charge coming. It just, you know, you can't, you know, it's like somebody telling you, you're not going to believe them again. So
sort of like being realistic about your business.
yeah, just be frank. If you say you know, we don't know, we're working on it, we're looking at it, but don't tell them you're not going to have it, when the marketplace, you know, when you logically look at things, you know something's coming down the road.
Using absolutes in this market is very difficult. Also, the one thing I'll add from my experience is the accountants, in terms of applying the impairment, aren't always very clear either. And I don't mean Keith from his angle, but when your auditors come in and they tell you you're below the fair market value, or better yet, your fair market value of your stock is below your identifiable goodwill, they say, okay, now that's a precursor to test. But the auditors will come in and say, well, if you've been there a certain period of time, you need to write it off anyway. And there's not a whole lot of clarity around it. I mean, there's still a lot of interpretation. So going back to Wayne's point, if you go in and say there will absolutely not be a goodwill impairment charge, then your auditors come in and tell you, well, you've got to write something down. And you say, well, my gosh, I've been telling the world I'm not going to have one. Now my credibility is impacted. So again, using absolutes in terms of a very still gray area is difficult. Secondly, to the point of even about global payments and other companies, to me, it's not necessarily even just do you violate a loan covenant, but do you violate part of your core growth strategy? If your growth strategy is surrounding acquiring companies that helps get you your premium multiple because you've consolidated and acquired, and then you buy the wrong company, is it in your core competency? Is it in the credit card processing piece, which is where all Global's growth is coming from, or it is in the money exchange business, which is not the growth business and not the direction of the company? So if it's part of the core philosophy and core growth of your company, and now it brings in Wayne to ask the question, well, wait a minute, you're going to grow 30%, 20% via acquisition, and 10% organic, and this blow happened in your core competency. Now I can't give you the premium valuation because you're not good at your core competency any longer. So that's also another way to look at it.
It does all circle back to some degree to the credibility aspect, because even when a company is not as lucky to not be affected on the downside with something like an impairment charge, if it has been communicating well, and there is, again, I'll harp on it, there's very strong credibility, even the downside risk is to some degree mitigated, and the extent to which the company is undervalued at that point is also shortened. It isn't always about, let's just say, maintaining the valuation, but also how quickly you come out of a trough. And a lot of that has to do with management and the executive team preparing the investment community for something that is going to be a reality, as opposed to just springing it on them.
Okay, next.
This question is probably best for Keith, but anybody can feel free to chime in. I'm just curious what the factors are that you're looking at in terms of testing the goodwill when indeed it's significantly higher than the market cap of the company. Our primary competitor did 2 very large acquisitions at the height of the market, and they've been sitting in this situation for probably over a year now. And we keep saying, I wonder what their conversations with their auditors must be like, but they still have yet to record an impairment.
Yeah, bit of a loaded question. So, from a practical perspective, we tend to look at these valuations using two primary approaches, a market approach and an income approach. And we absolutely must consider the environment we're in and the long-term expectations for the company. So using some of the items I put as well as some of the items that Wayne had on the screen with discounted cash flow analysis, we're absolutely looking at the long-term expectations for generating cash flow with that business. We can't ignore the current environment, but the valuation is based, significantly on longer-term expectations. So if we think there's a fundamental change in the market for that good or service, if we're not looking at projections from management that also reflect that fundamental change in the marketplace, then we tend to use discount rates that reflect our view on the market versus management's view on the market. So to say it differently, if we think cost of capital for the average business in this industry is 12%, but we think management's expectations based on reviewing projections and discussions with them are significantly dislocated from the market, then we do sensitivity analysis on our own to determine what discount rate or what cost of capital we would apply to those projections, assuming we were investing in that stock today. And so we do the same thing with relative expectations for margins relative to peer groups as well. If we think that management's expectations are significantly higher than the market on earning, unless we understand those reasons why, when we're executing these analysis, we make adjustments relative to margins based on guideline company analysis. We do the same thing when we're reviewing this sort of work that's done for our test clients. And so we look at it both ways. And we look at market valuations relative to market multiples as well, to the extent that we're valuing a company at, to be ridiculous, 20 times EBITDA when the rest of the market is at 10 times, we're going to significantly question that. But to the extent that we can identify material non-public information that impacts these valuations and that we have that information, we do take it into account as well. And the auditor is going to take it into account as long as the information is communicated well to the auditor and the auditor understands that that material non-public information would have a significant impact to value.
So Keith, let me follow up with that and ask you rather directly. Is there any unwritten rule through the SEC guidance that says if you've been underwater for 2 or 3 or a year and a half, is there any unwritten rule that says once you've been, your goodwill has exceeded your market cap for a year and a half or 2 years, when do you go ahead and say it's time?
To my knowledge, and recognize I'm not an auditor and don't know all of the SEC rules, but there is no rule that indicates from the SEC or nothing's unspoken from the SEC that would indicate that at some point you have to take an impairment charge. There's definitely unspoken and spoken indications that with certain circumstances we expect you to test for impairment, and based on comment letters I've seen, we don't understand how you could not have an impairment. Show us. I've seen those, and I've seen people come out on the back end successful. I've also seen people come out on the back end unsuccessful. It depends on management's ability to articulate why the value of that business is still there.
Which gets back to the relative uncertainty once again of communicating again any absolutes on when or if you'll have an impairment in that scenario.
And to protect yourself or your company against that, developing contemporaneous documentation around and robust documentation around the valuation of your business and being able to communicate that, which is very important to both Gene and Wayne, is also very important to the SEC.
Plan for your impairment
It's like buying insurance.
That's right.
Yeah, I had a question. In an ideal world, I'm just going to talk because I don't know if this is, no, it's on. In an ideal world, GAAP financials would provide the kind of metrics that the investment community would like to use. But increasingly, companies are using non-GAAP reconciliations and are moving away from GAAP earnings as something that they can report on a consistent basis. And in that sense, it's back to the dot-com era, Gene, which I think makes part why earnings is less popular as an important metric than it used to be. Are we in an environment, from your point of view, first of all, in which non-GAAP reporting and metrics are going to remain as important as they are now and maybe even gain in importance, free cash flow and those kinds of things? And if so, what advice do you have to investor relations people in an environment in which kind of non-GAAP things are more important?
Anyone want to step up? I don't know what Revon Research Group can offer on that type of subject, so I'll be the first to talk about it. But as on our end, increasingly we're seeing cash flow as opposed to earnings growth performance and earnings growth potential are the things that the investment community is attracting themselves to. But I have to say, though, I have to put a little bit of a caveat about that. Most of the work that we do on a custom side is with companies that are billion market cap and larger. So if you take the S&P 500, more often than not, the cash flow, what you're going to do with the cash flow, whether it's the returns or dividends, managing cash, managing the business is a lot of times more prevalent than showing strong growth constantly. On a more broad basis, though, when we do research amongst the clients, as you saw, cash flow, and somebody, I believe it was you, Wayne, that mentioned that ROIC, the degree to which that has become important. Going back to 2001, before that blow up in the marketplace, ROI really didn't show up at the top. It never really cracked the top 5. Cash flow barely scratched the surface, and then all of a sudden, that shift happened. And you're right, it was this equilibrium shift, and all of a sudden, earnings, EPS growth potential has started to go down, and cash flow has started to go up. So those are some of the things that we can offer up from some of the research that we've done.
I think the other thing I would add is, as you all know, the vast majority of public companies aren't the Fortune 500. They're the smaller and mid-tier. And it's really not, we can't be creative enough to set our own individual metrics that we want analysts to follow off of us. In many cases, it's the peer group of which we're a part of. It's the company groups that we're a part of. You can't go in and your whole peer group be based on an earnings per share directive, and you come in with an EBITDA plus an add back of this, this, and this, and go ahead and tell Wayne, well, I'm different. Well, Wayne's first question is going to be, well, why are you different when your other 8 competitors are being analyzed on a consistent set of metrics, a consistent valuation, and you want to be out here? So in a lot of cases, it's really not necessarily going to be driven by you. It's going to be, here is the peer group, or here is the group in which you play, and this is kind of where you fall in. And maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, and I know companies that have tried just what he described, to where they would say, well, we're not going to, we don't think comp store sales is an important metric anymore, so we're not going to disclose it, or we're not going to talk about it. Their stock was crushed because of it to some extent, and then ultimately they had to reverse that decision. So you've got to recognize what people are looking at and not dismiss it or think it's not that important, because it's important to them from a valuation standpoint. I think from a GAAP versus non-GAAP measure, I know myself, and I think the analyst community and the portfolio manager community are still going to look at non-GAAP measures. As much as you may think that's not the way we should, it's still going to be very much there. I think from what I've seen over time, going through cycles, there was a period in the 80s and early 90s where we had economic cycles and balance sheets were stretched and LBOs didn't work and things like that. And what I recall back then is cash flow was important then, and balance sheet was important and things like that. As the cycle begins to change, what people put emphasis on will change, and I think that will happen now. It just so happens we're coming out of a period where obviously you wanted to make sure people were going to be in business and the cash flow was there and things like that. But as the economy begins to accelerate, there will be a focus back towards the earnings growth rate will move back up from where you had an 8, 10, whatever it may be. It will move back up. It's just right now there's so much focus on who's going to be able to survive the downturn.
And I'm sure it already has. That was a real shock, kind of a number for that one instance.
Do we have any further questions? Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Do I hand it off to anybody at this point?
Yes, I do, but let's give these guys a round of applause. I want to thank everybody for coming today. And before we go, I have a couple of comments. The CLEs, CPEs, go to the registration table. And then there is lunch downstairs. You can go to the elevators, go down one floor, and there will be signs to direct you. It's a roped-off area, hot buffet lunch. Hope you stay. And finally, I want to thank Beverly Verico. Beverly, stand up, please. Please. She put a lot of work into this, and also she had a bunch of helpers. Bill McCarthy helped, and I'm sorry I'm not listing everybody, but thanks everybody for all your help. Thanks.